Wave Sound Audiobooks presents Great Furphies of Australian History by Jim Haynes, narrated by Jim Haynes. For Robin. Australian history is almost always picturesque. Indeed, it is so curious and strange that it is itself the chiefest novelty the country has to offer. And so it pushes the other novelties into second and third place. It does not read like history, but like the most beautiful lies, and all of a fresh new sort, no mouldy old stale ones. It is full of surprises and adventures and incongruities and contradictions and incredibilities. Mark Twain, Following the Equator. Introduction. When Lies Become Legends. "You should say what you mean," the March Hare went on. "I do," Alice hastily replied. At least I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know." "Not the same thing a bit," said the Hatter. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, 1865. One of the greatest of all Aussie myths relating to our landscapes and characters and lifestyle is that we inhabit a land of deserts, tough outback characters, rural pursuits and vast stretches of bushland. Well, Australia does have vast bushland and vast deserts, and there are a few tough outback characters, though they're hard to find these days. The truth is that Australia ranks in the top 5% of the most urbanised nations in the world, and our population hugs the coast. Only a tiny percentage of our population has ever lived in the outback, and it is as big a mystery to most Australians as it is to the rest of the world. The outback, for most Australians, is an exotic tourist destination. The distinguishing factor that shaped our history and our national character is actually the fact that we are surrounded by ocean. Before the European invasion, the vast majority of indigenous people lived on the coast or within easy reach of the sea. When Europeans arrived, they had to cling to the coastal areas of the continent for obvious reasons. Firstly, that's where much of the fertile land is and easy access to fresh water. Secondly, the sea was the primary means of transport until quite recently. It was the major link for Australians travelling to other parts of the country, and indeed it was Australia's only link to the rest of the world. We became a wealthy nation not because we produced wool, gold, beef, coal and iron in vast quantities from the inland, but because clipper ships and steamers carried our wool, gold, beef, coal and iron to the world. The distinguishing characteristic of Australia's history and lifestyle is that we are girt by sea. Australians, along with all other human beings, believe many things that are not true. This is because we've been told about them by people we respect: teachers, those in the media, authors, religious leaders, family members, and the stories have been constantly repeated in history books, textbooks, advertising material, trivia quizzes, and by word of mouth. Often we believe them because we simply like the story that goes with the lie, and even enjoy passing it on because it makes us seem well-informed, knowledgeable, and clever. If the lie seems a more interesting and colourful story than the truth, chances are that it will become generally accepted and passed around until it becomes the myth that most people choose to believe, without even challenging the story by applying any test of probability, credibility or common sense, or testing its validity with any research. Once the myth is accepted, it often becomes part of the collected information on Google and Wikipedia, and then there is a good chance it will become widely believed and disseminated as the truth. Often these stories become accepted and popularised in the form of an urban myth, and although many of them are easily proven to be untrue by even the most cursory research, they continue to be believed. With such things as bush folklore, mistaken word and name derivations, and sporting history furphies, These misconceptions that become myths are merely an annoyance to pedants and those with particular related academic or recreational interests. Often sentiment plays a part, and comforting lies are more palatable than uncomfortable truths. There is, however, a far more sinister side to myth creation. There are times when the creation of myths can have the effect of perverting both our history and our culture, if we're not careful. The attempted demonisation of James Cook and the beatification of Edward Kelly are perfect examples of this. Although much of the factual and circumstantial evidence shows that Kelly was a violent and egotistical career criminal, a pathological liar and a murderer, the myth of the brave rebel fighting for the rights of the underdog against harsh persecution has persisted, flourished, and grown out of all proportion. Of all the Aussie myths, the story of the Kelly gang is the easiest to debunk through research. Yet the myth is so strong in Australian minds that it is virtually impossible to demythify. You have to strain credibility, common sense, and much of the written evidence to near breaking point in order to establish and validate the myth of Ned Kelly. But people keep doing it. If this continues, who knows? We may one day see a biography that reads, Edward Kelly was famous in Victoria during the late 1800s. His business empire grew through livestock trading and the acquisition of valuable equestrian assets and innovative banking schemes. Beginning in 1870, he devoted several years of his life to government service, finally taking leave to resume his dealings with the livestock industry. In the late 1870s, he was a key player in a vital investigation run by the Victoria Police Force. In 1880, Mr. Kelly passed away during an important civic function held in his honour when the platform upon which he was standing collapsed. In the case of James Cook, a complete lack of any understanding of what the man was about and how much control he had over his own destiny has led to his place in our history being totally misrepresented in recent times. Here is a perfect example of the past being judged by those who have no concept of history and can only think of the past in terms of their own modern-day moral compass and sentiments, in an age of entitlement and individual rights. Researching and writing these accounts has reinforced my belief that any understanding of the past requires the ability to shift the mind to other times and understand the social and political landscapes in which these people then operated. The reason several of the parts of this book are longer than others is that the truth is always in the background to the story, never in the events themselves. Understanding history is not about knowing what happened, it's about knowing why it happened. To understand any event in any war or discovery or social conflict, it is essential to have some knowledge of the politics of the time, the diplomatic skullduggery of the period, the social forces at work within the population, and the accepted laws, conventions, and spiritual ideas of the age. I have attempted to expose some of these Australian myths and misconceptions by explaining the facts, as far as they can be discovered by research, and the social and political contexts in which the events occurred. Part 1. Commonly Believed Aussie Furphies. Why sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Through the Looking Glass, Lewis Carroll, 1871. The Common Sense Test. Occasionally, when I'm giving talks on Australian social history, I meet people who simply refuse to believe certain things in spite of the fact that the truth is often glaringly obvious and provable. Some of the iconic Australian furphies and fallacies are so deeply embedded in our minds through repetition and our desire to believe them that accepting another truth is a very hard thing to manage. Challenging the version of events that people have always accepted as the truth and often feel quite comfortable with, and even proud of, sometimes meets with strong resistance. They have fond memories of the people who told them the furphy, parents, grandparents, teachers, and don't wish to believe that they were wrong. After telling an audience about the truth behind the ashes myth, for example, I have on several occasions had men tell me that while they concede my version could be true, they will continue to believe what they were told as kids. One fellow even told me his great-uncle knew someone who was there at the Oval in 1882 when it happened and saw it, in spite of the fact that no one has ever claimed the supposed burning took place on a field immediately after the game. I always invite an audience to step back mentally from what they have been told and apply the common sense test. How likely is it, for example, that cricketers in the moment of historic victory would suggest burning something? And just how do you burn a hardwood cricket bail, a wooden stump, or a leather and cork ball and collect the ashes? Why would anyone walk a valuable racehorse to Melbourne when every other horse went by steamship? And so on. The truth is that we believe what we want to believe. Not everyone wants to be confronted with a new truth when they have believed the old one all their lives. The Ashes Myth. The first cricket test was played in 1877 between the touring Englishman and a combined Australian 11. What is significant about that? Well, there was no Australia in 1877. Cricket gave us an Aussie identity 24 years before we were a nation, and it had a huge effect on national spirit, even though only 3 colonies were represented in the team: New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. British teams had toured here from the 1850s but had always played against teams of 17 or 15 players from each separate colony, and in 1866 an Aboriginal team toured the UK as much as a novelty as a sporting team, but they did quite well on the field, winning 14, losing 14 and drawing 19 matches in 6 months. New South Welshman Charles Bannerman set 2 records in the first test ever played, and one will never be beaten, although the other might be. He scored the first run in test history and scored 67% of the runs in an innings. He made 165, retired hurt. There was controversy right from the beginning. Due to the bitter intercolonial rivalry that existed at the time, the 2 best bowlers in the country refused to play. Victorian Frank Allen decided to go to the Warrnambool show instead, and New South Wales bowler Fred Spofforth would not bowl to the Victorian wicket-keeper Jack Blackman and boycotted the match. There's also an irony in our first Test team's make-up. 7 of the Australian team were born in Britain, including Bannerman. The next year a combined team, including Spofforth, paid their own way to the UK and destroyed W.G. Grace's MCC side at Lord's, bowling them out for 33 and 19. In this match, Spofforth gained his nickname, the Demon Bowler. Sadly, this match was not given Test status. A total of 8 tests were played before 1882, 7 in Australia and 1 in the UK. Australia won 4 tests, England won 2 and 2 were drawn. In 1882, England lost at home for the first time, and Spofforth won the test for Australia, taking 7 for 44. He bowled his last 11 overs for 2 runs and 4 wickets, and Australia won by 8 runs. After the match, the following poem was published in Punch magazine. "Well done, cornstalks, whipped us fair and square. Was it luck that tripped us? Was it scare? Kangaroo Land's demon, or our own want of devil coolness, nerve, backbone." Also a mock obituary was famously inserted in the Sporting Times, which read, "In affectionate remembrance of English cricket, which died at the Oval on the 29th of August 1882, deeply lamented by a large circle of sorrowing friends and acquaintances, rest in peace. N.B. The body will be cremated and the ashes taken to Australia." This was the beginning of the Ashes myth, which is not really a cricket story at all. It's a love story. When the man who would become the 8th Earl of Darnley, Ivo Bligh, led the English team to Australia in the following English winter, the English press joked that he was going to bring back the Ashes. After his team won 2 of the 3 official tests in Sydney, they moved on to Melbourne, where they were invited to stay at Rupert's Wood, the palatial home of Sir, later Lord, William and Lady Clark, who had met Bligh when they travelled back home on the SS Peshawar, which was bringing the English cricket team to Australia in 1882. During a party at Rupert's Wood, a group of ladies, including Ivo Bligh's future wife, Florence Morphy of Beechworth, made a presentation to him of a terracotta scent bottle which contained some ashes. It was a continuation of the joke about the death of English cricket and the cremation of the body and the ashes being taken to Australia. The presentation was received with much amusement, and when the team was leaving for home, the presentation was repeated, after a small plaque had been added to the scent bottle. Florence Rose Morphy was the youngest of 7 children of an old friend of the Clarks, a gold commissioner and police magistrate in Beechworth who died in 1861. The family were living on a government pension at Hawthorn in Melbourne when, in 1881, Florence became the governess and music teacher to the Clark children at Rupert's Wood, where she and Ivo Bligh met for the first time on the 15th of November 1882. The story is more a love story than a cricket story. Bligh, who had injured his hand and could not play in many of the tour matches, spent much of his time at Rupert's Wood courting Florence, and wrote home to his father, telling him that he had met the most delightful creature, whom he intended to marry. In spite of some opposition from his family due to the fact that she was a colonial lass and the Morphy family had become quite impoverished after the death of Florence's father, Ivo Bligh returned to Australia to marry Florence in St Mary's Church, Sunbury, in 1884, not long after the team had arrived home in triumph carrying the ashes. Back in Britain, Ivo inherited the Irish peerage as the Earl of Darnley when his older brother Edward passed away in 1900. Florence became the Countess of Darnley, and the couple lived as Lord and Lady of the Manor at Cobden in Kent, where during World War I they opened Cobden Hall as a military hospital. Florence worked as the matron, and more than 2,000 Australian soldiers received treatment and recuperated there. In 1917, Prime Minister Billy Hughes spent Christmas at Cobden, and in 1919, Florence Bligh, Countess of Darnley, was made a Dame of the British Empire in recognition for her efforts during the war. When Ivo died in 1927, Florence presented the little trophy to the MCC, and consequently its ownership resides with that organisation. It was originally a personal gift from a future wife to her future husband, but has evolved into the Ashes, the coveted prize for the winner of cricket tests between England and Australia. A replica, and since 1999 a Waterford crystal trophy, are presented to the holders of the symbolic ashes. In 1998, the Darnleys' 82-year-old daughter-in-law wrote to the MCC and declared that the ashes in the terracotta scent bottle were the remains of her mother-in-law's hat veil. MCC officials are, however, 95% certain that the urn contains the ashes of a cricket bale, most likely one used in a social game between the English team and one chosen by Sir W.J. Clarke. While bale and veil sound similar and a misunderstanding is plausible, anyone understanding the nature of the joke presentation and how hard it is to actually cremate a cricket bale and recover the ashes will realise that the ashes are, in all likelihood, derived from something much easier to incinerate than a wooden bale. It is highly unlikely that cricketers after an important win would be bothered incinerating a hardwood bale or stump or cricket ball, and the joke death notice in the Sporting Times in 1882 and the letter to the MCC in 1998 make the truth fairly apparent. There is even an uncorroborated apocryphal story that the little bottle fell from the mantel at Cobden Hall and the original ashes spilled out and were replaced by ashes from the fireplace. The Countess of Darnley died in August 1944, aged 85. The Garn. Ask any Aussie why the train that runs from Adelaide to Darwin is called the Garn, and most will tell you it was named as a tribute to the Afghan cameleers who carried goods through the outback before there were trains or roads and carried the materials to build the railway. That is what the railway publicity tells you. It's in all the encyclopediae and is a widely accepted fact. However, it is not true. In the 1920s we had a White Australia policy, and we were not given to naming things after ethnic minorities. Although Western Australians had voted yes to federating in the second referendum after voting no in the first one, the very hesitant Western Australian government had prevaricated until the last minute and finally agreed to join the other colonies when promised an East Coast to West Coast railway. In fact, the Western Australian government hesitated so long that Western Australia had no input at all into the drawing up of the Australian Constitution. This came back to haunt them in 1933 when they voted at a referendum to leave Australia, with 68% agreeing, only to be told by a select committee of the British Parliament that it was not possible to change the Australian Constitution. By 1917, a line was built from Port Augusta in South Australia to Kalgoorlie in Western Australia, and the Commonwealth Railways had at least built a section of a transcontinental line. The Commissioner of Commonwealth Railways, Norris Bell, for reasons best known to himself, then decided to extend, at Commonwealth expense, a line that ran north from Port Augusta to Oodnadatta. It was to be extended into the middle of nowhere. The middle of nowhere was a town called Stewart, later known as Alice Springs. The Commonwealth Government completed the section from Rumballara to Stewart. The southern section of the Great Northern Railway had been begun in 1877 by the South Australian Government. The line ran from Port Augusta to Oodnadatta, and the train was a limited mixed that was given the official title of the Oodnadatta Night Train. A limited mixed is a goods train that has a passenger carriage attached and operates on lines where there is a limited demand for a passenger service. After the route was extended, it became known as the limited mixed once more. This meant that, due to very few passengers wanting to use it, it was not a passenger train but a goods train with a passenger car tacked on. In 1926, the Commonwealth Railways took over the South Australian line from Port Augusta to Oodnadatta because it linked Adelaide to the South Australian East-West Express line, which ran from Tarawi in the east of the state to Port Augusta via Peterborough and Quorn. This meant that, with many bewildering gauge changes, there was a service from Adelaide via Tarawi to Melbourne, via Peterborough and Broken Hill to Sydney, and via Port Augusta and Kalgoorlie to Perth. On the 6th of May, 1929, a fellow from Prahran in Melbourne had taken over as Commissioner of Commonwealth Railways when Norris Bell retired. His name was George Garn, pronounced Garn. So the legendary Garn came into existence on the 4th of August 1929 when the first passengers arrived in the town of Stuart, Alice Springs. The train was 2.5 hours late, and the name was adopted as a private staff joke at the expense of George Garn, Commissioner of the Commonwealth Railways, who was on that first train. Most of those on the train were only going as far as Quorn to access the East-West Express to Tarawi or Peterborough in order to reach the eastern states. Commissioner Garn had a special commissioner's carriage built. The carriage cost £7,584 of the Commonwealth Government's money and featured an observation saloon with curved glass, 4 sleeping compartments, a bathroom, a dining saloon, a kitchen, and a compartment to accommodate the 2 male servants. The interior of the car was of the best Tasmanian oak. The train was slow, the section from Quorn to Stuart regarded as unnecessary by many, including many in the South Australian Railways at the time. It was also regarded as an extravagant toy for the Commissioner and a waste of federal money. Staff on the train often outnumbered passengers, and there was no way the train could have ever covered its costs. The line was beset by problems with washaways and derailments, termites eating the sleepers, and notoriously sloppy work practices, so much so that the Commonwealth Railways, which operated the service, was often referred to as the comical railways. As it was considered slow and useless by railway staff, they took great delight in sarcastically christening the train Garn's Express, as a derogatory joke at their commissioner's expense. It later became the Garn. So the story of the derivation of the name Gan, pronounced Gan, which most people believe because they are told it over and over, is another self-perpetuating myth, a Furphy. Australia's car. It has long been believed that the much-loved legendary Holden was the first car specifically designed for Australian conditions. Well, that's not a legend, it's another myth. During World War II, the Australian government, along with both Ford and General Motors Holden, explored the possibility of a locally produced affordable motor car. The Holden Company began in 1856 as saddle and harness makers. In 1908, the company moved into the automotive field before becoming a subsidiary of USA company General Motors, GM, in 1931. After World War II, General Motors Holden continued to pursue the idea of a locally produced vehicle. Managing Director Lawrence Hartnett wanted a local design, while General Motors preferred to see an American design. The final design for Australia's own car was based on a US-designed but previously rejected post-war Chevrolet. Incidentally, the name Holden was chosen in honour of Sir Edward Holden, the company's first chairman. Other names considered were Gem, Austral, Melba, Woomera, Boomerang, Emu, and Canberra. Who crossed the Blue Mountains? History is so often simplified to the point where it becomes untrue. We are told that a certain person discovered something or achieved something or invented something when the truth is it was a team effort, or the result of a series of explorations or developments or inventions. There are many examples of this in our history, and no doubt in the history of all nations. One example that is particularly annoying to Australian historians and aviation buffs is the credit given to the Wright brothers for inventing and pioneering powered flight. Earlier pioneers like George Cayley, Horatio Phillips and Percy Pilcher in Britain, the Voisin brothers in France, Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont, Australian Lawrence Hargrave, and even American Octave Chanute are rarely mentioned. Hargrave undoubtedly flew a powered aeroplane over Sydney Harbour before the Wright brothers' efforts, but never claimed it as a first. What makes this even more galling is Hargrave, who did not believe in copyrights or patents, made his work known and freely available to others, while the Wright brothers used his ideas and inventions and patented several of them. This dumbing down of history is partly our fault for wanting things to be simple. Who invented powered flight? Real answer? Octave Chanute, George Cayley, Horatio Phillips, Percy Pilcher, the Voisin brothers, Alberto Santos Dumont, Lawrence Hargrave, and the Wright brothers, and others. Too hard? Simple answer, the Wright brothers. Sometimes it's about self-interest and who had the biggest ego or needed to be recognised. Other times, as in the case of the first crossing by Europeans of the Blue Mountains, status and snobbery are also involved. The credit is given to 3 gentlemen in 1813, Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth. The names roll off the tongue and are easily remembered and often repeated. However, there were quite a few others lower down the social scale who went before them. It is known that Lieutenant William Dawes of the Marines made a 3-day foray into the mountains directly west of the colony with Lieutenant George Johnston and Assistant Surgeon Lowes, at Governor Phillip's request. They trekked into the mountains as far as the present-day town of Lyndon, quite early in the colony's history, in December 1789. Further to the north, in 1795, ex-convicts Matthew Everingham and John Ramsay, accompanied by William Reed, a sailor from the First Fleet, explored well past the site of the present-day town of Bilpin and stood on top of Mount Wilson just some 20 kilometres east of where Lithgow is today. In 1797, George Bass set out with a party of strong, reliable fellows and provisions for 2 weeks. He had specially made ropes, scaling irons that fitted over boots and hooks that fastened to hands. The party made it as far as Pulpit Rock, near Blackheath. John Wilson, an ex-convict, crossed the mountains further south in January 1798, 15 years before the famous trio Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth, who get all the credit. Wilson was accompanied by Governor Hunter's servant John Price and a convict named Rowe. They made the first recorded sightings of lyrebirds, koalas and wombats, and passed into the rich country west of the Great Dividing Range near the Wombeyan Caves. They had, in fact, gone over a very low part of the range, you might say, around the mountains. The official records of the Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth expedition, including the diaries of the explorers, make no mention of the names of the 4 servants who accompanied them. The Sydney Gazette only mentions the expedition briefly at the time, and it is not until 100 years later that the 3 explorers are made heroes in history books for school kids. So that bit of our history seems to have been invented at a time when historians were looking for heroes, around the time of Australia's federation. Convicts were unsuitable as role models, it seems, so the long-forgotten expedition by the three gentlemen was dusted off and became a feat of great endeavour to inspire the new nation. 5 convicts were remunerated for their services in the first 2 expeditions across the mountains, the one with Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson, and the next with surveyor George Evans. It is possible that an ex-convict, James Byrne, was the first European to cross the mountains west of Sydney and later led the 3 famous gentleman explorers across. Byrne is never mentioned by name in Blaxland's journal, being referred to only as a man who was used to shooting kangaroos in that country, and a servant. Byrne was born in 1769 in Wicklow, Ireland, and arrested for taking part in the Irish War of Independence in 1798. He was transported for life as an Irish rebel on the Anne, arriving in Port Jackson on the 21st of February 1801. Records show that he was paid from the police fund for services as a guide to the party who crossed the Blue Mountains and for services in making discoveries west of the Blue Mountains. 5 other convicts or ex-convicts were paid by the police fund for services in making discoveries west of the Blue Mountains in a document dated 30th of April 1814 and received grants of land in December 1814 for crossing the Blue Mountains. The earlier date of 5th of February 1814 for James Byrne, as well as other research, indicates that he was part of the first official expedition over the Blue Mountains. All 5 convicts accompanied George Evans on the second expedition. James Byrne was granted a conditional pardon for his work as a guide to Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth, and later a full pardon for his work with Evans. He was granted land at Appin, which he never took up, and later moved south with his family to settle at Collector, where he died in 1849. Mr. Gaucher's protest. William Gaucher is credited as being the man who enabled us all to enjoy swimming at the ocean beaches of Sydney in daylight hours, when, supposedly, he famously swam in defiance of the local government restrictions on bathing, which were enforced by local councils under the Police Offences Act No. 5 of 1901. Section 77 of the Act read, "Whosoever bathes in any part of Sydney Cove or in any waters exposed to view from any wharf, street, public place or dwelling house in or near the said city or towns between the hours of 6 o'clock in the morning and 8 in the evening shall be liable to a penalty not exceeding £1." Gaucher was an interesting character. Born in Ipswich in the UK in 1856, he and his siblings were all converted to Catholicism when young, and William and 2 brothers migrated to Australia. William arrived in 1872 and worked as an artist and journalist. He was a champion of the Bimetallic League and published a pamphlet, "Australia, the Light of the World," challenging the use of the gold standard and promoting the state takeover of the banks. His ideas were derived from the Jewish capitalism media conspiracy theories current at the time, and another pamphlet, "Australia Must Be Heard," called on the Pope to intervene in World War I. Gaucher stood for election several times at state and federal level, but was never elected. In 1901, he finished 49th of 50 candidates in the Senate elections. In 1900, Gaucher inherited money and set up the Manly and North Sydney News. He was not, as many have claimed, editor of the famous Manly Daily, which was not established until 1906. The Australian Dictionary of Biography entry on Gaucher, written by Bruce Mitchell in 1983, states that In 1900 he moved his family to Manly and established a short-lived newspaper, the Manly and North Sydney News. Through this paper he staged the scene at Manly for which he is remembered. He determined to expose the irrelevance of the local government regulations which forbade sea bathing in daylight hours. The issue was one of public decency, as there were no changing sheds and swimming costumes were rare. Clad in a neck-to-knee costume, Gosha, in October 1902, swam at midday after announcing his intentions in his paper. Twice ignored by the authorities, he duly criticised their lack of zeal. On a third occasion, he was escorted from the water and interviewed by the police, who brought no charges. In November 1903, the reluctant Manly Council resolved to allow all-day bathing, rapidly growing in popularity, provided that a neck-to-knee costume was worn. Gosha claimed a triumph, and in 1907 friends presented him with a gold watch and a purse of 50 sovereigns. Some elements of Mitchell's Australian Dictionary of Biography entry are true, others are not. As a supporter of the Manly Progress Association, Gosha had apparently campaigned for changing sheds at the beach, but there is no evidence of the headlines or stories of the supposed protests in police records, and no copies of the relevant Manly and North Sydney News exist. In an article written in 1910, Gosha claimed that he questioned the police about the arrest of several yachtsmen for having a swim and learned that bathing in the open ocean was forbidden after 7 a.m. It was actually 6 a.m. Gosha wrote, "My ire was aroused at the absurdity and injustice, so I rose up on my hind legs and informed the police that they would have to arrest me on the following Sunday as well, for I meant to test the matter." According to Gosha, neither the police nor anyone else turned up on the beach to witness his swim the next Sunday, so the next issue of my paper was flavoured with cayenne pepper for the police for not doing their duty. I announced my intention of going in for a bathe at precisely the same time and at the same place. Certainly, more people rolled up to watch events, still no police. However, on the occasion of my third dip, matters commenced to be merrier. The law swooped on me, and I was trotted along to the limbo. Frank Donovan bailed me out. On the 11th of November 1951, the Sydney Sunday Herald, in response to a letter from Gosha's daughter, Mrs. Marnie, about her dad's supposedly forgotten place in surfing history, ran a nostalgia piece in which a retired police officer, Peter Eppel, claimed the incident happened between 1885 and 1892. It was probably sometime in 1885, just after he joined the police. It was certainly before 1892, the year he resigned. He was patrolling the Corso at Manly when his sergeant gripped his arm and pointed. "What is that man doing in the surf?" he demanded. "Bring him in at once, the damn fool, the sharks will get him." It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. In the sparkling water a figure was splashing. Constable Eppel obeyed orders. He walked down to the water's edge and called the man to the beach. It was Mr. Gosha. He was wearing a pair of old grey trousers, cut off at the knees, and from the waist up he was naked. Constable Eppel and his sergeant ordered him to dress and come along with them. In a little while he was facing a magistrate. The actual wording of the charge against him eludes Mr. Eppel today, but it was something to the effect that he had been found in the ocean, whither he had gone to the danger of his life and limb. The magistrate was obviously aghast, yet he was a tolerant man, and after cautioning Mr. Gosha on the folly of his act, allowed him to go. A day or two later, Mr. Gosha was back. Constable Eppel and his sergeant had espied him in the surf again at the very same spot. This was open defiance, and the magistrate showed his displeasure by imposing a fine of 10 shillings. But when the same offender was observed again in the surf only a few days later, Constable Eppel considered that other treatment was necessary, and this time brought him to the city. The magistrate's eyebrows rose as he listened to this strange recital. Clearly, he decided, the man's mentality should be examined. He announced, "You will be remanded to the reception house for 7 days." So Mr. Gosha was taken away, and a week later stood again in the place of law. 2 doctors who had studied him during his remand gave evidence that, in spite of his persistence in going into the surf, his brain was clear. He was in full possession of his senses, and was undoubtedly sane. The following edition of the Sunday Herald reported on the 18th of November, "Last week the Sunday Herald told the story of ex-constable Peter John Eppel, who remembered, he said, exactly what befell Mr. Gosha because he was one of the policemen who arrested him 3 times for bathing in the surf at Manly. That story really started something. The ink was hardly dry on it before telephones began ringing in our office. Then letters arrived. Everybody wanted to tell us how wrong Mr. Eppel was." Other versions of the incident that rolled in, to be collected and published in the Sunday Herald the following week, included Gosha's own 1910 account from a press clipping kept by the Manly town clerk. Another retired policeman, Mr. J. L. Jones, claimed that he was present and the local police had been instructed to allow bathers to swim until 8 a.m. A deputation of bathers from Manly had been to see the Chief Secretary before this, and the police were told to leave them in until 8 o'clock. It was against the law, but those were our instructions. They went on bathing until 8 o'clock for a few months. On the day in question, according to ex-Constable Jones, Mr. Gosha went in wearing a 3/4-length frock coat, striped trousers and a hard hat, and he had an umbrella under his left arm. I can see it all quite clearly. There were 3 of us there, Senior Constable A.J. Taylor, Constable John Kiley and myself. We had reported Mr. Gosha's intention to headquarters, and we had been advised to take no notice. He waded in up to his armpits, made 2 strokes, and then came out and walked up to us expecting to be arrested. There were 200 or 300 people watching. They opened up to make way for him. We took no notice. He was never arrested." William Gosha's daughter, Mrs. Marnie, countered. "Mr. Eppel and Mr. Jones are both wrong. It was in 1902. And Dad was in his neck-to-knee swimming costume. No man would go in for a swim with a hard hat on and a frock coat and with an umbrella. And he certainly was arrested, although he was never fined. I can vow to that." What we have here is a perfect example of how fake news, unreliable memories and Furphies can, with the passing of time, create the myths that are believed and repeated until they are part of a false history. In this case, the history of how swimming in the surf became part of our lifestyle. What is the truth? Well, the truth is that none of the jumbled tale of Mr. Gosha and the police on Manly Beach is really relevant to how local government attitudes to bathing in daylight hours were challenged and changed. For a start, swimming at ocean beaches had been occurring since the 1880s. The real problem was the one of decency, caused by some men either skinny dipping or wearing quite skimpy swimsuits. This prevented the small number of female bathers, who would have enjoyed swimming in the surf, from doing so. Female swimmers felt they should keep away from where the men might be indecently dressed, and ladies were, therefore, restricted to the ladies-only ocean baths, which were situated on many beaches. Historian Pauline Kirby, whose meticulous research gets us closer to the truth than any number of newspaper articles, states, "In the early 20th century, swimming in daylight hours was quite common in Sydney, and provided that modest bathing costumes were worn, caused little concern. But this was easier said than done, and there were regular complaints that beachgoers' bathing attire did not provide sufficient coverage. With no real swimming costume manufacturing industry at the time, the bulky costumes that were available were expensive. Many working people therefore cobbled together swimming gear that did not always stay in place, especially in the surf. The real catalyst for change came not at Manly, but on the other side of the harbour at Bondi, and it was an officer of the law who precipitated the change rather than the bathers, although they certainly had a role to play. It is due to Pauline Kirby's research that Gaucher's shenanigans on Manly Beach, no matter which version you choose to believe, can be shown to have had minimal effect on how attitudes and council bylaws concerning daylight bathing were changed. As she points out, the real heroes of the change to common sense were Inspector General of Police Edmund Fosbury and 15 anonymous bathers on Bondi Beach. Swimming and surfing in daylight hours became legal in Sydney as the result of an incident on what would later become Australia's best-known beach, Bondi. As at Coogee and Manly, ocean bathing had been popular there since the 1880s. So, when on the 13th of November 1902, two policemen unexpectedly appeared on the beach with notebooks in hand, regular early morning surfers were defiant. This police visitation was a result of a complaint to Waverley Council that, unless they are properly and becomingly clad, bathers at Bondi were in breach of the Police Offences Act No. 5 of 1901. When they saw the officers, most of the bathers held back, but about 15, only 2 were in proper bathing costumes, plunged into the water. The police officers immediately began taking the names of those clad in small trunks, with a well-known local clergyman and several equally respectable men among the miscreants. A furor erupted. As a result of the commotion, the police were reined in. Inspector General of Police Edmund Fosbury wrote to Waverley Council, putting his policy on public record. So long as the bathers wear suitable bathing costumes and public decency is not outraged, I am unable to see that a practice permitted for so many years should be stopped. Unless, therefore, I receive instructions from the government to the contrary, I do not see my way to take action beyond instructing the police that decency is to be observed. Despite the Police Offences Act, no one was going to be prosecuted at Sydney's beaches as long as Fosbury was in charge. 10 days after this declaration, Randwick Municipality proposed allowing daylight bathing, the first to do so in New South Wales. In early December, the Executive Council gave its approval for this bylaw. Thereafter, males and females were allowed to bathe in the sea in the municipality at all times and at all hours of the day, provided they were clothed from the neck and shoulders to the knees with a suitable bathing dress or costume. Other local councils followed suit. Apparently Manly Council delayed for some time because councillors felt that the operators of the local baths, who leased the area from the council, would be adversely affected. As the lease on the baths expired in 1903, they felt that a change would be unfair before that time. When the lease expired, they followed other councils in making the change in the bylaws. Inspector General of Police Edmund Fosbury will never get the recognition he deserves as the man who changed surf bathing history with the common sense solution he proposed in 1902. On the other hand, there was a proposal to build a statue of William Gaucher at Manly, and in 1952 a block of Housing Commission flats was named after him. The statue never eventuated, but in 1980 a plaque was placed at South Staine Beach to mark the spot where he is said to have swum in defiance of council bylaws. The Sunday Herald pointed out in 1951 that the Police Offences Act No. 5 of 1901, Section 77, was still technically valid at that time, and millions of Sydney-siders were happily breaking the law on Sydney's beaches with impunity. What the Herald never mentioned, however, was that the credit should go to a sensible old copper named Edmund Fosbury, not William Gosher. Our drinking reputation. Although Australia has a very alcoholic history, many of the things that people believe about our drinking habits are not necessarily true. It is true that we are probably the only nation in the world who can boast a Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, who held a record for beer drinking, 1.4 litres in 11 seconds, if such a thing is something to boast about. As far as I know, we are also the only nation in the world to have had alcohol as our official currency. Although, at that stage, of course, we were not a nation, it was merely the colony of New South Wales that used rum as currency. Perhaps some of us tend to exaggerate the historic influence of alcohol on Australia. After all, the attitude to drinking and the tendency to drink to excess was something we inherited with our British background. There is no real evidence to suggest that the levels of drinking and the results of the evils of alcohol were any different in the British colonies in Australia from what they were in Britain at the time of colonisation. The only way to reach the colonies in the Antipodes was by sailing ship, and alcohol was part and parcel of both the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy. The German botanist Johann Forster, who replaced Joseph Banks on Cook's second voyage of discovery, described the crew as solicitous to get very drunk, although they are commonly solicitous about nothing else. The acceptance of drunkenness and the tolerance of overindulgence in alcohol as a lifestyle was part and parcel of both naval life and working-class life in Britain in the 18th century, and it was transferred to the colonies of Australasia along with everything else British. The mutiny by the 99th Regiment in Sydney in 1846 was ostensibly caused by the abolition of the daily grog ration on the orders of Colonel Despard. It was really a strike that lasted approximately 4 weeks and ended when the rebels learned that 400 troops from Hobart were on board the ship Tasmania standing off Sydney Heads. The mutiny was, in fact, a protest against Despard's over-officious style of leadership and his attempts to separate the troops from the townspeople. Evidently, he was of the opinion that the troops might have to be used against the unruly part-convict population, and he was dead against them being seen to be part of the general community. He was concerned that the Foreign Service grog ration encouraged the troops to be far too like the people they were there to control. Despard, who famously led a disastrous campaign in the Maori Wars, also gave an order that prohibited citizens from walking on any part of the grass-covered area in front of the barracks when listening to the band play. This had been the town's chief entertainment for many years. The 99th were so annoyed when Despard stopped their grog ration that they forgot their obligations to their Queen and country by refusing to obey the lawful commands of their officers or to perform any further duty, and went on strike. The bark Tasmania was chartered, and 400 men and officers of the 11th Regiment in Hobart embarked for Sydney to disarm the mutineers of the 99th Regiment. An offshore gale kept the vessel from entering the harbour for 7 days, but eventually The 11th Regiment arrived in Sydney on the 8th of January 1846 and marched 4 deep with fixed bayonets along George Street with the band playing Paddy Will Ya Now until they entered the Barrack Square to a hearty welcome and cheers from the 99th Regiment and their families, together with as many citizens as could fit into the barrack grounds. Thus ended the mutiny of the 99th Regiment. The grog ration was restored and Sydney's citizens were again allowed to walk on the grass in front of Barrack Square and listen to the band play on Thursday afternoons. One thing to note here is that the 99th were a British regiment. One of the most common myths about Australians is that we are great beer drinkers. This is simply not true anymore. Before the advent of refrigeration, rum and other spirits were the popular drinks, along with some styles of beer that are drunk at room temperature, like ale and porter. After it became possible to refrigerate beer, we became prone to drinking relatively large amounts of cold lager due to the climate being rather hotter here than in Europe, which is quite understandable. There was a period when we were quite famous for overindulgence in lager. The soldiers' riots that occurred on Valentine's Day 1916 in Liverpool and Sydney were the result of trainee soldiers being denied access to alcohol at the overcrowded army training camps in the Liverpool district. This mutiny was one of the reasons New South Wales adopted the infamous 6 o'clock closing, which led to binge drinking of cold lager and many social problems. Some other states had similar legislation and similar social problems, such as illegal liquor sales, the development of criminal networks and police corruption. Today, Australia rates a lowly 17th on the list of nations judged on the consumption of beer per head of population. Our figure is 75 litres per head per year, which puts us in the same ballpark as the USA, 73 litres, and the UK, 70 litres, but way behind European nations like the Czech Republic, 189 litres, Austria, 108 litres, Romania, 100 litres, and Germany, 99 litres. In Africa, Namibia, 96 litres, beats us hands down, and in Central America we lag a full 3 litres behind Panama, 78 litres. I regret to inform those who take pride in our beer-drinking reputation that we rank higher, 14th place, in the list of wine-drinking nations. Melbourne Cup mythology. Since the Melbourne Cup was first run in 1861, the Australian public have clamoured to believe the most ridiculous and romantic tales of coincidence, supernatural premonition, and divine intervention. Each year brings new examples of heroism and perseverance as horses, jockeys, and trainers battle, overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds to achieve victory. This all began with the Furphy of Archer's long walk to Melbourne to win the first cup. Some gullible souls even believe he did this walk twice to win the first 2 cups. This walk never happened the first time around, and to suggest that Australia's most successful trainer of the era, Etienne de Mester, would have sent his valuable cup winner from the previous year on a second arduous marathon walk is laughable. Yet many believe it, despite accounts from the time that Archer, like all other normal human beings and horses, made his way to Melbourne by ship. Newspaper accounts of the day show that Archer left Sydney on the 18th of September 1861 on the steamer City of Sydney, together with 2 stablemates, Exeter and Inheritor, and arrived at Port Melbourne 3 days later. Also on board were Etienne de Mester and jockey Johnny Cutts, who was in fact John Cutts Dillon, one of the most respected jockeys in New South Wales. Despite stories to the contrary, Cutts was not from the Nowra district and never lived there, although his brother-in-law, Walter Bradbury, worked for Demester and lived at Tarara, about 3 kilometres northeast of Nowra. This pretty much puts a hole in the theory or legend that Johnny Cutts was born and raised in the area around Nowra, supposedly one of the many Aboriginal stockmen who replaced the stockmen of European descent when they left to join the gold rushes. There is an even more ridiculous legend that Archer's strapper, Dave Power, not only walked him to Melbourne, but rode him under Cutts' name in the Cup, and was of Aboriginal descent. Perhaps Power walked Archer to the nearest port of embarkation from his home on the south coast of New South Wales, or perhaps he walked him from the Port Melbourne docks to the hotel stables at South Yarra, where he was trained for the first Cup, but he certainly never walked him to Melbourne from his home near Nowra, nor did he ride him in the Cup. Archer went by steamboat from Sydney to Melbourne 3 times to compete in Victorian races in 1861, 1862 and 1863. Demester's horses usually boarded the steamer at Adams Wharf, near his property at Tarara on the Shoalhaven River. However, floods in 1860 altered the course of the river channels and made navigation dangerous. So, from 1860 to 1863, horses needed to be walked to the wharf at Greenwell Point, 13 kilometres to the east. Perhaps this was the origin of the walking to Melbourne legend. The longest distance Archer ever walked was the 250 kilometres from the end of the railway line at Campbelltown to his owner's paddock near Braidwood, when he retired from racing in 1864. Etienne Demester, cunning as he was, may have enjoyed spreading the ridiculous rumour about the walk as part of his plan to empty the pockets of Melbourne's bookmakers. It is more obvious, however, that he achieved his goal by keeping the Sydney horse away from prying eyes and training him in what was then known as St Kilda Park, opposite the Botanical Hotel, where he was stabled in South Yarra. Archer had won his last 7 starts in Sydney, but those wins were spread out over a year, and the form of the various colonial horses was not easy to compare. It was the Cup that would eventually bring Australian champions together from around the continent and give us a real Australian racing scene. Demester single-handedly backed his victorious horse in from 8-1 to 6-1, with the result that the bookmakers of Melbourne were left reeling and more grist was added to the mill of interstate rivalry, or intercolonial rivalry, as it then was. Neither the handicapper nor the bookmakers of Melbourne missed Archer the following year. He was given 10 stone 2 pound, 64.5 kilograms, to carry and was favourite at 2-1. Of course, he added another chapter to Cup history by winning yet again. In the true spirit of colonial rivalry, Archer was given the massive weight of 11 stone 4 pounds, 72 kilograms by the handicapper in 1863. Demester had paid the first acceptance fee of 5 sovereigns and was incensed when weights were announced. However, he eventually relented, and Archer and another runner from his stable, Hady, left by steamboat for Melbourne on the 16th of June. Demester's agents reminded him on the 1st of July that he needed to send final payment and acceptance that day, so a telegram was sent to the Melbourne office of George Kirk and Company, asking them to accept on his behalf. Demester sent the telegram himself, as the due date was a normal working day in New South Wales, and records show it was received at the Melbourne Telegraph Office at 1 p.m. However, Wednesday the 1st of July was a public holiday in Melbourne, and the telegram was not delivered until 7:30 p.m. Acceptances closed at 8 p.m. And when George Kirk handed the telegram to the stewards at the Victorian Turf Club the next morning, those honourable sporting men, having found a loophole to stop Archer once and for all, decided it was too late. The decision caused a furore at the time. Even Victorian owners lobbied the club to accept the entry, but to no avail. Mind you, it was highly unlikely that Archer, carrying 11 stone 4 pound, could have won anyway, and the Victorian owners doubtless realised this. If he had run, it would have been the biggest weight carried in the history of the Melbourne Cup. All the interstate entrants pulled out in protest, and only 7 local horses ran in what is considered the worst and weakest cup in history. It was won in front of 7,000 people by Banker, carrying 5 stone 4 pound, 34 kilograms. It is both fitting and ironic that the public holiday that enabled this unsportsmanlike decision to be made was Separation Day, the day that Victoria celebrated its official separation from New South Wales in 1851. Archer was taken by train to Ballarat in August 1863 and ran poorly in a sweepstakes race. He was suffering from fever and an injured fetlock and returned to Sydney to recover to be trained for the Metropolitan Handicap of 1864. He broke down once more on the eve of the race, however, and never raced again. Although Archer is shown in the record books as being owned by Demester, and he raced in the trainer's famous all-black colours, he was actually leased by Demester and was always owned by an old school friend of Demester's, J.T. Roberts, in partnership with his brother-in-law and 2 nephews. Archer was retired to stand at stud at his owner's property, Exeter Farm near Braidwood, where he was foaled for a fee of 10 guineas, but his progeny failed to win a stakes race, bearing out, perhaps, Demester's opinion that Archer was not among the best horses he had ever trained. Archer died aged 16 in 1872. An ornament made from his tail hair, coiled into a horseshoe shape, set in silver and mounted on red satin, can be seen at the Australian Racing Museum in Melbourne. So, right from its very beginnings, the Cup was shrouded in myths, tall stories, and romance. This ends CD 1. CD 2. If looked at devoid of its myths and fairy tales, the first Melbourne Cup was a rough-and-tumble affair. 1 horse bolted off the course during the race, 3 of the 17 runners fell and 2 died. 2 jockeys were seriously injured and suffered broken bones. Archer defeated the favourite and local champion, Mormon, by 6 lengths in the slowest time in Cup history, 3 minutes 52 seconds, in front of the smallest crowd ever, 4,000 people. Archer had previously defeated Mormon over 2.5 miles in the Australia Plate at Randwick, so the form was there to see, and Demester's betting coup was a real triumph over local pride. An injury to Archer, real or feigned, leading up to the race may have helped the price to get out to an appetising 8-1 before Demester pounced and reduced the odds to 6-1. Demester also took home the £710 and a handmade gold watch for the win. There was no second prize, so the locals were left empty-handed. The second year the odds were not as juicy. Archer won by 8 lengths, a feat not equalled until Rainlover won by the same margin in 1968. His trainer took home £810 and another watch. Mormon again ran second and collected £20. Etienne de Mester was a colourful character who became part of Cup legend by training 5 winners, a record that lasted for 99 years until Bart Cummings broke it in 1977. The famous trainer was one of 10 children of another fascinating character in our history, Prosper de Mester. The son of a French officer fleeing the Revolution, Prosper was born at sea on a British ship after his father's death. He was raised and educated in America after his mother remarried, and he lived and traded in China, India, and Mauritius before arriving in Sydney, where his right to trade as a foreigner was challenged, and he subsequently became the first person ever to be naturalised as an Australian, or at least a British subject in Australia. Etienne himself had 11 children and developed the land his father was granted at Tarara near Nowra into a successful racehorse training and breeding establishment. Archer's stable is still there, in fact. It's a bed and breakfast establishment today, and if you are prepared to believe Cup and local folklore, you can spend a weekend sleeping where Archer was supposedly stabled for most of his racing life. Maybe you believe he walked to Melbourne too. Other Melbourne Cup folklore includes the tale of the 12-year-old Aboriginal boy named Peter riding Briseus, the first female horse to win in 1876. The story goes that Peter was born on the St Albans stud property near Geelong to an Aboriginal mother. Perhaps he was the son of St Albans owner Jim Wilson Sr., or his son, also Jim. Another version has the boy being left as a baby on the doorstep of one of St Albans' grooms, Michael Bowden, to be raised by him and his wife. As he had no real surname, so the story goes, he was given the name of the property and became Peter St Albans' youngest jockey and first Aboriginal rider to win the Cup. Unfortunately, this wonderful story, like Archer's walk to Melbourne with his Aboriginal strapper jockey, has more holes in it than Swiss cheese. 2 elements of the story are true. He was known as Peter, and he was very young. In fact, he was only 12, and oddly enough, this explains the whole wonderful concoction. Peter had ridden Briseus as a 2-year-old to 3 victories at Randwick earlier in the year, including an incredible win in the Doncaster Handicap, where he rode her at 5 stone 7 pound, 35 kilograms. However, the Victoria Racing Club, VRC, rules did not allow jockeys to ride in the Melbourne Cup until they were aged 13, and Peter was a few days shy of his 13th birthday on Cup Day 1876. The regular jockey for St Albans horses was the legendary Tom Hales, who could not make the Cup weight at 6 stone 4 pound, 40 kilograms. As Briseus won most of her big races as a 2- and 3-year-old, she was given a very light weight to carry, which meant that a good lightweight jockey was required. Few grown men could ride at those weights, but Peter was an excellent rider who knew the horse as a stable boy at St Albans and had ridden her to victory in 3 races in Sydney. So cunning old Jim Wilson came up with the cock and bull story of Peter's origins to allow him to ride Briseus in the Cup. He argued to the VRC that both the boy's birth date and parents were unknown, but he was probably older than 13. Peter St Albans was actually born Michael Peter Bowden in Geelong on the 15th of November 1864, and there is a birth certificate to prove it. He was the son of Michael Bowden, who worked at St Albans, and his wife. Although christened Michael, he was known as Peter from an early age. There is a painting at the State Library of Victoria by Frederick Woodhouse showing Peter as a youth, looking very white and European, standing alongside Briseis as her strapper, with Tom Hales in the saddle. Michael, Peter St Albans Bowden, was a successful jockey for several years around Geelong, and also rode successfully interstate until a bad fall at age 19 saw him switch to training. He died in 1900 at the age of 35. The Geelong Thoroughbred Club awards the Peter St Albans Trophy each year to the jockey who rides the most winners at the Geelong track. The Rum Rebellion. The so-called Rum Rebellion of 1808 was not called by that name until after 1855, when an English Quaker historian, William Howitt, wrote a history of Australia and exaggerated the alcoholic aspect of the rebellion in order to stress the evils of drink. Howitt invented the term Rum Rebellion, and it stuck, which meant other important aspects of the power struggle have been forgotten. Before Howitt intervened, the event was generally known as the Great Rebellion. Howitt was an interesting character. Born in Derbyshire in 1792, he was educated in Quaker schools and became an author and radical free thinker. He worked as a farmer and travelled the English countryside studying nature. He taught himself languages, botany and chemistry, and worked as an apothecary. After his marriage in 1821, he and his wife began publishing his varied writings, and he served as an alderman in Nottingham before moving his family to Germany for several years. In 1852, aged 60, he sailed for Victoria with his 2 sons and spent 2 years on the goldfields. They found very little gold, but the 2 years spent travelling the colonies provided material for Howitt's writing. After returning home, he produced, among his many writings, A Boy's Adventures in the Wilds of Australia, 1854, Land, Labour and Gold, or 2 Years in Victoria, 1855, Tallangatta, The Squatter's Home, 1857, and The History of Discovery in Australia, Tasmania and New Zealand, 1865. In England, the family continued their writing, publishing and philanthropy until 1870, when they moved to Rome, where Howitt died in 1879. There was, of course, some truth in the idea that the rebellion was partly connected to rum. The rum monopoly began in 1793, just after Governor Arthur Phillip had returned to Britain and left Major Francis Grose temporarily in charge of the fledgling colony. An American ship with the ironic name of Hope sailed into Sydney with a cargo that included 7,500 gallons of rum. The captain, one Benjamin Page, refused to sell his cargo except in one lot, including the rum. The colony had almost starved 3 years earlier, and all supplies were scarce. In light of this, and partly to prevent the captain from holding the colony to ransom, the officers of the New South Wales Corps banded together with Major Grose's blessing to purchase the entire cargo. This gave them a monopoly on rum, which they exploited whenever a new ship arrived in the colony. Until 1814, rum was an accepted currency in New South Wales. Soldiers were paid in rum, as were convicts who worked on officers' land. According to historian George McManus, the population of Sydney in 1806 was divided into 2 classes, those who sold rum and those who drank it. Simplifying history is, however, always a dangerous practice. In the Sydney Morning Herald article dated 26 January 2006, historian, journalist and publisher Michael Duffy made an attempt to give a more balanced view, claiming Bligh's removal was not about him preventing army officers profiteering through rum. Almost no one at the time of the Rum Rebellion thought it was about rum. How it took Bligh's side and invented the phrase Rum Rebellion, and it has stuck ever since. Duffy points out that the colony's per capita intake of alcohol was no more and possibly a little less than Britain's at the time. He also makes the point that by the time Bligh became governor in 1806, ex-convict entrepreneurs such as Simeon Lord and immigrant businessmen like Robert Campbell were making inroads into the office's monopoly of trade. Duffy could have added another ex-convict to that list. James Squire, transported for stealing chickens, was the first successful brewer in Australia. After receiving his ticket of leave in 1791, he obtained a licence to sell liquor in partnership with Simeon Lord. In 1792, they set up the Malting Shovel Tavern on the river at Kissing Point near Ryde. It was at the halfway point on the river between the two settlements of Sydney and Parramatta, and it proved a great success. Squire added 12 other land grants to his own 30 acres, 12 hectares at Ryde, and eventually had an estate of more than 800 acres, 324 hectares along the Parramatta River. He cleverly complained to the colonial secretary about neighbouring land grants not being taken up and consequently purchased several of them for a shilling each. Oddly enough, the brewing of beer was seen as a good thing for the colony that was corrupted by the trade in rum. Beer was considered a sobering influence, and Governor King tried hard to get the inhabitants of New South Wales to drink beer rather than rum. Squire was much praised for his efforts in growing hops and grain and producing and selling a decent brew. Beer was actually considered to be a healthy and efficacious beverage. This belief was partly due to the fact that small beer, very mildly alcoholic beer, less than 1%, was universally consumed in parts of Europe, especially Northern Europe and the Low Countries, throughout the medieval times and into the 17th and 18th centuries. Small beer was brewed in most households for consumption by workers, children and servants because water sources were polluted, and the brewing process meant small beer was a safer way to quench the thirst. It was common for men doing heavy manual labour in hot weather to consume 6 litres or more a day of small beer. Squire was an industrious and successful farmer. He was also a gypsy, or Romany, one of only 2 on the First Fleet. Gypsies were denied civil rights in Britain, but they had good knowledge of hop cultivation, as they provided the itinerant workforce for hop planting and picking. One hop vine Squire cultivated in 1806 covered 5 acres, 2 hectares, by 1812 and produced 700 kilograms of hops. As a brewer, he was similarly successful. By 1820, his brewery was producing 40 hogsheads, about 10,000 litres of beer a week. When he managed to cultivate a hop vine in 1806 from plants he had been given a few years before, he took the first small crop to Governor King, who was so overjoyed at Squire's achievements that he directed that a cow be given to Mr. Squire from the government herd. When he died in 1822, his funeral was the largest ever seen in the colony up to that time. His grandson, James Squire Farnell, was Premier of New South Wales from 1877 to 1878. But I digress. Back in 1806, Bligh, who took over from King as governor, had been given the unenviable task of wresting control of the 20-year-old convict colony away from the officers of the New South Wales Corps. especially John MacArthur and Major George Johnston, who had, along with others like Surgeon General Thomas Jamison, managed to effectively run the colony to suit themselves, receiving huge land grants and monopolising trade in food and goods, including rum, which was the colony's de facto currency. Previous governors Hunter and King had failed to break the power of the New South Wales Corps and had retired defeated. The problem was, in part, due to the fact that the governors before Macquarie, Phillip, Hunter, King and Bligh, were Navy men, while those in control of the colony were Army officers or ex-officers who had established themselves as the colony's leading free citizens. Governor William Bligh was a hero in the eyes of the Admiralty, having helped win the naval battle of Camperdown off the Dutch coast during the French Revolutionary War. He also defied the mutineers on the Bounty and then navigated the ship's launch, in which he and 18 loyal crew members were set adrift, across 7,000 kilometres of open sea via the island of Tofua, where they were attacked and one man was killed. They then sailed past Fiji and across the Coral Sea to the coast of northeast Australia, through the Great Barrier Reef and on to Dutch Timor. The launch was designed to hold 10 men. The voyage lasted 45 days, and the remaining 17 men and Bligh made it to Timor. Bligh was seen as a hard man who could take control of the colony and sort out the problems caused by opportunism and monopolies, but he was short-tempered and undiplomatic. He was given direct instructions in London to take control of the rum trade out of the hands of the officers, and he did ban the use of spirits as payment for other goods and stop John MacArthur importing stills to make rum. But that was only a small part of the power struggle that led to the rebellion. Bligh stopped land grants, removed military men from the court system, and favoured the poorer free settlers who needed help after the Hawkesbury River floods of 1806. Poorer settlers and ex-convicts were being forced to pay high prices for meat and other goods which were monopolised by the officers of the New South Wales Corps and other large landholders. In order to maintain a more usual style of authority, Bligh's successor, Major General Lachlan Macquarie, who was obviously not a naval officer, arrived with his own regiment in 1810, and the New South Wales Corps was renamed the 102nd Regiment of Foot and sent back home. At last the colony had an army man in charge, a canny Scot. Macquarie cleverly established a currency by purchasing a cargo of 10,000 Spanish dollars in 1814 and having the centre cut out of every coin. This had the double purpose of providing 2 coins of different denominations and rendering the coins useless outside the colony, so the currency remained in New South Wales. This strange coin, known as the Holy Dollar, the bit in the middle of less value was known as the dump, replaced rum as the colony's currency. Macquarie was to write another chapter in the alcoholic history of New South Wales. In order to further control the rum trade, he gave the monopoly to import the spirit to a group of businessmen. In exchange, they built Sydney Hospital in Macquarie Street. So Sydney's first major public institution was built in exchange for the monopoly on importing rum, and was known for years as the Rum Hospital. The so-called Rum Rebellion was about many things. Like all events in the past, it can only be truly understood by studying the political and social context in which it occurred, and the events leading up to it. Sadly, time and space prevent me from doing that, but we can take a quick look at just one factor. Bligh's arrival marked the end of the policy of making generous land grants. His immediate predecessor, Philip Gidley King, had granted about 62,000 acres, 25,000 hectares, to businessmen, government officials and officers of the New South Wales Corps. MacArthur, for example, had been gifted 5,000 acres of prime grazing land at Camden. During Bligh's relatively short reign, a mere 4,000 acres were granted, and half of those were to Bligh and his family. MacArthur and Bligh had been sniping at each other ever since Bligh's arrival. MacArthur had made life unbearable for previous governors, Hunter and King. Basically, it was a case of Navy men being appointed to govern a colony that Army men were running to suit themselves, riding roughshod over any official attempt to thwart their often corrupt practices. The actual events that precipitated the mutiny were all ridiculously trivial. After a convict apparently stowed away and fled the colony on one of MacArthur's vessels, Bligh ordered forfeiture of the normal bond paid by shipowners to guarantee convicts did not escape on their ships. Then MacArthur had paid to import a still, one of two that eventually arrived in the colony, and by Bligh's orders it had to be sent to the government store. MacArthur had ordered the second still, but had agreed to comply and to hand it over as soon as it arrived. On arrival, it was delivered direct to MacArthur, and Bligh demanded it be handed over. MacArthur agreed to do so, but said he wished to keep and use the boiler component, and would hand the alcohol-making component over soon. Bligh then sent soldiers to seize the still. MacArthur was summoned to appear before Judge Atkins, and when he failed to do so, Bligh had him arrested. He was bailed and refused to be tried by a court that included Atkins, who was his debtor and sworn enemy. The other 6 magistrates, all members of the New South Wales Corps, sided with MacArthur. Bligh accused them of mutiny. On the 24th of January 1808, things came to a head. Bligh ordered MacArthur's arrest, the Corps refused to carry out the order, and so it progressed. Finally, the officers of the Corps and some prominent citizens signed a petition declaring Bligh unfit to exercise the supreme authority another moment in this colony, and the naval hero was placed under house arrest by the colonial army officers. The only resistance to the army invading Government House was offered by Bligh's daughter, who attacked the soldiers with her parasol. Johnston, who had by now been promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, took over the colony, and he appointed the Surveyor General Charles Grimes as Judge Advocate. MacArthur and the 6 officers were tried and found not guilty. MacArthur then became Colonial Secretary. Colonel William Patterson returned from Tasmania to attempt to keep some semblance of order, and Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Favreau was sent back to the colony and appointed acting governor. The result was that finally an army man, Major General Lachlan Macquarie, was appointed as the next governor, and he reversed all land grants made by Johnston and MacArthur and reinstated all the officials they had sacked. Johnston was court-martialed and found guilty. Cashiered from the army, he returned to the colony as a private citizen. MacArthur was banned from the colony until 1817, and Bligh was promoted to Rear Admiral. The irony is that Johnston was the one man who could have prevented the mutiny, as he was often able to negotiate a mutually agreeable way forward between the short-tempered Bligh and the devious MacArthur. When Bligh summoned him to sort out the mess on the 25th of January, he failed to show up, as he was indisposed and injured. He had dined with officers of the Corps the evening before, overindulged, and crashed his gig on the way home. So it was an early drink-driving accident that prevented Johnston from turning up to work the next day, and possibly preventing what would later be called the Rum Rebellion. How Australian is Foster's? In the 1970s and 1980s, you may well have heard the phrase as Aussie as Foster's Lager in Britain and the USA especially, where Foster's was marketed as the beer Aussies made and loved to drink. The slogan for Foster's was, "It's Australian for beer." Well, it may have been marketed as Australian for beer, but what is the answer to the question, how Aussie is Foster's? If you take the nationality of the founders of Foster's famous beer into account, it's not Aussie at all. It's American. The Foster brothers, William and Ralph, arrived in Melbourne in 1887, and they were not primarily interested in beer or brewing. They were pioneers in the refrigeration industry, and they arrived with the latest in refrigeration equipment. They brewed beer in order to demonstrate the wonders of refrigeration. They set up their brewery and, in 1888, successfully brewed the first local lager-style beer in Australia, a beer that needed to be kept cold to be enjoyed properly. Having done what they had planned to do, Ralph and William promptly sold their entire enterprise to some locals in 1889, and Ralph went to Italy and then back to the USA. William moved to Sydney, where he lived out his life quietly. His descendants live there still. In 1908, there was a massive amalgamation of breweries in Melbourne. Carlton, Macracken City, Castlemaine, Shamrock and Foster's breweries all combined to form Carlton United. And the Foster's brewery in Rokeby Street was closed, and the Foster's name was almost lost. Carlton United only continued to brew a beer branded as Foster's because there was some demand for the label in Queensland and Western Australia. In 1971, Foster's was introduced to England through Barry Humphrey's highly successful cartoon strip in the magazine Private Eye. The strip was used as the basis for two very successful movies, The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie and Barry Mackenzie Holds His Own. The hero of the cartoon strip and movies was rarely seen without a can of Foster's in his hand, and Foster's took off in Britain, where cold lager-style beer was just taking over the beer market from the more traditional styles of porter and ale. Foster's then launched into the USA in 1972, where it was marketed along with Sport. Foster's sponsored the 1972 America's Cup Challenge and Tennis Championships, and it was the official Olympic beer for Australia at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. For more than a decade, from 1985, the Melbourne Cup was known as the Foster's Melbourne Cup, and John Newcombe claimed in advertisements that he drank 5 cans after each tennis match. Then Paul Hogan was brought into the advertising campaign. Hoag's first Foster's commercial script read, "G'day. They've asked me over from Oz to introduce yous all to Foster's Draft. Here it is. Cripes. I better start with the basics. It's a light, golden liquid, except for the white bit on the top, the head, and it's brewed from malt, yeast and hops. Technical term is lager. That's Lager, but everyone calls it Foster's. Ripper. Tastes like an angel crying on your tongue. Foster's." Of course, the famous Aussie Foster's Lager, marketed to Poms and Yanks, was also brewed to local tastes locally, not here in Australia. Foster's is brewed in 8 countries, including China, Spain and Sweden. It is sold in 135 countries. Us Aussies living in Britain and the USA in the 1980s spent a lot of our time telling the locals that we didn't drink Foster's at home. After all, it was an American invention. While we're on the subject of iconic Australian brews, Castlemaine beer is not strictly Aussie either. Castlemaine Brewery had been founded by the 2 Irish Fitzgerald brothers. They migrated from Galway in 1859 and began their brewing business at Castlemaine in Victoria. In 1875 they established a brewery in South Melbourne, and in 1877 they had also set up in Brisbane, where from 1878 they brewed the famous Castlemaine ale that became associated with Queensland, although it was named after a town in Victoria. The beer became Castlemaine 4X in 1916, and ever since that time the joke has been that it's called 4X because Queenslanders can't spell beer. If you're wondering what 4X was called before 1916, cease wondering. From 1878 to 1916, it was called Castlemaine XXX Sparkling Ale 3X. Part 2. Australia is not the Great Southland. What's the good of Mercator's North Poles and Equators, tropics, zones and meridian lines? The bellman would cry, and the crew would reply, they are only conventional signs. The Hunting of the Snark, Lewis Carroll, 1876. Birth of a Legend. I have to risk upsetting fans of the much-loved 1980s rock synth band Icehouse by announcing that Ivor Davies' inspirational song, Great Southern Land, is based on a false premise. Our country, the continent now known as Australia, is not, and really was never thought to be, the much-fabled and sought-after Great Southland. To fully understand why we are not the Great Southland and how the title, along with the name Australia, was eventually attached to our continent, we need to follow a thread of connected events that begins when scholars realised that the world was a globe, in about 350 BC, and continues until James Cook proved, once and for all, in 1775, that the mythical Great Southland did not exist. The Great Southland was a large land mass believed to exist in the South Atlantic or South Pacific Ocean, perhaps in both, at a similar latitude south to that of Eurasia's latitude north, i.e. between 40 degrees and the pole. The idea that there had to be a Great Southland developed this way. Scholars had known that the world was round since the time of the ancient Greeks. Pythagoras, after studying the moon, proposed the idea around 500 BC, and some 50 years later, Anaxagoras studied eclipses and came to the same conclusion. Around 350 BC, Aristotle declared quite confidently that the earth was a sphere. Late in the 2nd century AD, the Greco-Roman scholar Ptolemy, living in Egypt, produced reasonably accurate descriptions and maps of the geography of the Northern Hemisphere, excluding North America, by using a grid to plot latitude and longitude. His work was mostly forgotten until the 14th century, when it was copied and translated by monks in Constantinople and introduced to European academics by the Byzantine scholar Emmanuel Chrysoloras and the Italian Jacobus Angelus. Using Ptolemy's ideas, European mapmakers and geographers like Johannes Honta in Romania began making predictive maps of the world. Honta's 1545 map shows a large continent called Australia, extending from the South Pole northward to around latitude 45 degrees south. Basically, it looks like a huge Antarctica, stretching up to about where New Zealand's South Island is. This was, of course, quite wrong, but the idea had developed that there had to be a huge landmass at the bottom of the world to balance the huge landmass at the top. Crazy as it may seem, this idea persisted among scholars and geographers right up until James Cook's time. As these latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere were conducive to habitation that led to farming, civilization, trade and wealth, it was believed that similar conditions in the Southern Hemisphere would have produced the same sorts of results, and these southern civilizations would therefore have products to trade like the spices of Asia, or treasures for the taking like the slaves of Africa and the silver, gold and emeralds of Central America. The idea of balanced hemispheres and curiosity about the unknown southern half of the planet was apparent in the popularity of the term antipodes, Latin, opposite the feet, in the 17th and 18th centuries. Europeans were fascinated by the idea that they lived on a globe, and there was a world diametrically opposed to their feet on the other side. Fantastic adventure stories published as accounts of actual voyages were popular in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, and many were written. In 1676, Frenchman Gabriel de Guagné published La Terre Australe Connue, the Southland Revealed, an account of a journey to Australia, where the inhabitants were 8-foot-tall vegetarians who lived in an idyllic democracy. English books like The Life and Adventures of Peter Wilkins, Robert Patlock, 1751, and The Life and Astonishing Adventures of John Daniel, Ralph Morris, 1751, and satirical books like Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, 1726, were set in the Antipodes. Belief in the Great Southland was reinforced by these books. While the term Antipodes tended to be used in literature, Australis, Latin, south, was more common on maps. Names used for the Great Southland were Terra Australis or Terra Austral, land of the south, Australia, south continent, and the slightly more sceptical Terra Incognita, unknown land. Indeed, the Great Southland, as it was perceived by those who believed in it, was not only unknown, it was non-existent. By giving this undiscovered, fabled land meaningful Latin names, geographers and mapmakers placed it in the realm of probability. Most geographers assumed it was there, somewhere. Once shipbuilding technology and navigation science had developed to a point that made it possible to explore the oceans outside of Europe, the exploration of the southern hemisphere was only a matter of time. It turned out to be quite a long time, 4 centuries. The Age of Discovery. Prince Henry and the Knights of Christ. The ancient world was relatively small in global terms. Indeed, Mediterranean means in the middle of the world. Until medieval times, the Mediterranean and North Seas were the only oceans Europeans could explore with the maritime knowledge and nautical technology available. Other oceans were beyond the realms of European knowledge. A vast improvement in maritime technology took place during the lifetime of Prince Henry, Infante Dom Henrique of Portugal, 1394 to 1460. He is the man credited with beginning the Age of Discovery. He set up a maritime and navigational training school at Sagres Point, at the tip of the peninsula where Europe ends and the vast Atlantic Ocean stretches to the horizon. The place was known as El Fum do Mundo, the end of the world. Henry was the 3rd son of King John João I of Portugal, and Philippa of Lancaster, a member of the English royal family whose marriage to John in 1386 created the Treaty of Windsor, a long-standing alliance between England and Portugal that led to the special relationship the two nations have maintained ever since. Prince Henry is known in English as Henry the Navigator, although this term is not used in Portuguese, and Henry never sailed on any of the voyages of exploration. He had access to vast amounts of money, which he used to finance expeditions to attack Moorish cities and fund the organisation of his nautical training institution and build fleets of ships. Where did that money come from? Well, back in 1305, the French king, Philip IV, owed a fortune to the Knights Templar, who were the bankers of Christendom and the protectors of the faith in the Mediterranean. Philip managed to get his lifelong friend Raymond Bertrand de Goth, Archbishop of Bordeaux, elected pope, although he was not even a cardinal. He became Pope Clement V. Under the influence of Philip IV, Clement V supported an evil scheme to have the Templars declared heretics. On Friday the 13th of October 1307, in a surprise move throughout France, the Templars were arrested and imprisoned. Their monies and treasures and property were seized by the state, and many knights were tortured and burned at the stake as heretics. This wiped out Philip's debt and gave him access to a fortune. Clement V moved the papal court to Avignon, in the Kingdom of Arles, to the south of France in 1309. Although the Order of the Knights Templar had been annihilated throughout France and in many other parts of Europe, King Dinas I of Portugal had not joined in the persecution, and after the next pope, John the 22nd, retrospectively absolved the Templars of heresy and ordered what was left of their assets to be held by the Church, Dinas revived the order at the Templars' Tomar stronghold in central Portugal under the name the Order of the Knights of Christ. Pope John the 22nd issued a papal bull, Ad Ea ex Quibus, on the 14th of March 1319, which recognised the new order and gave it the right to inherit Templar assets and properties. For most of his adult life, Prince Henry of Portugal, born a century later, was the Grand Master of the military order of the Knights of Christ, and the vast wealth of the order financed the Age of Discovery. During Henry's lifetime, the Portuguese developed and refined the caravel, a seaworthy, manoeuvrable ship that was able to tack and sail against the wind, and a larger, partly square-rigged sea-going vessel called the carrack. These vessels were originally 50 to 100 tons. Going to sea in one would have been quite terrifying. Henry's captains found Madeira, 1418, the Azores, 1427, and the Cape Verde Islands, 1456, which all became Portuguese colonies. In 1473, 13 years after Henry died, Lopez Gonçalves became the first European to sail across the equator, and in 1488, 15 years later, another Portuguese captain, Bartholomew Dias, rounded the bottom of Africa and sailed into the Indian Ocean. In May 1498, a fleet of Portuguese ships led by Vasco da Gama reached India. The Portuguese opened trade routes and formed alliances with various rulers along the east coast of Africa and in India and the Spice Islands, and thus fulfilled Prince Henry's dream of breaking the monopoly on the Asian spice trade, until then held by Islamic nations. Da Gama was appointed Portuguese viceroy to India in 1524. Both Dias and Da Gama were Knights of the Order of Christ. The success of the Portuguese Empire was to be built on the African slave trade and spice, and the remnants of the treasury of the once mighty Knights Templar. The Pope divides the planet. Portugal and the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon dominated world exploration and waged war on each other intermittently until Aragon and Castile were united by a royal marriage. The Treaty of Alcazabas in 1479 divided overseas discoveries into two agreed zones, Spanish and Portuguese. In 1494, Pope Alexander VI sanctioned the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the New World territories between Portugal and Spain by papal decree. An imaginary line was drawn 370 degrees west of the Cape Verde Islands. Spain could claim new lands to the west of the line, and Portugal everything to the east. By a quirk of fate, the dividing line, drawn down the Atlantic, intersected the landmass of South America and ran through what is now Brazil, and thus Portugal claimed it. The problem was that no one was sure what happened when the line was extended around the other side of the globe, so another papal decree tried to sort that out in the Treaty of Zaragoza, 1529, and Portugal got the Moluccas, Spice Islands. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese Italian sailing for Spain, found the Caribbean islands and Americas in 1492. In South America, Hernan Cortés conquered the Aztecs, 1520, and Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incas, 1533. Portugal kept Brazil. The rest of Central and South America was Spanish. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese employed by Spain, entered the Pacific Ocean from the east and found the Philippines in 1521, and Spain began to colonize the islands in 1565. In 1567, Alvaro de Mendaña crossed the Pacific from Peru, discovered the Solomon Islands, lost most of his men to scurvy, and was horrified to discover the inhabitants were cannibals. 25 years later, he led a second expedition of 4 ships carrying 380 men, women and children to settle the islands, but he couldn't find them again. They attempted to settle on the largest of the Santa Cruz Islands, about 400 kilometres southeast of the Solomons, where Mendaña and others died of fever. Guided by a young navigator named de Quiros, 2 of the ships made it to the Philippines, where, 3 months later, Mendaña's widow married the governor's son. Of the 380 who left Peru, 290 died of starvation, fever and scurvy. De Quiros made another attempt to find the elusive Solomon Islands in 1605 and, in May 1606, reached Vanuatu, which he assumed to be a northern extension of the Great Southland and named Australia del Espiritu Santo, Southland of the Holy Spirit. He later altered it to Austriala del Espiritu Santo, Austrian land of the Holy Spirit, in honour of Spanish King Philip III, a member of the Royal House of Austria. After conflict with local tribes, the explorers left the island in 2 ships and became separated in a storm. On de Quiros's ship, the crew mutinied, locked him in his cabin and sailed to Mexico. On the other ship, Luis Valles de Torres decided to go his own way and, while charting the southern coast of New Guinea, saw very large islands at the 11th degree of south latitude. What he saw was the coast of Australia, where 6 months earlier Dutchman Willem Janszoon, also known as Jantz, had sailed, making maps of what he thought was the coast of New Guinea. Torres wrote an account of his discovery, which remained a secret for 155 years. During the 7 Years' War, the British East India Company captured the city of Manila in 1762 and held it till the end of the war. An ambitious young employee of the company, Alexander Dalrymple, found the account in the Manila Library and translated it. Mr. Dalrymple has a major part to play in our story, but not yet. The age of discovery coincided with a period of astonishing brutality called the Spanish Inquisition. All the Holy Lands won in the Crusades were lost to Christianity by 1291, and Spain's neighbours to the east and south were Muslim. Islamic rulers controlled the Middle East and the lands that stretched to India. Religious fervour and fear of losing power led to a desperate desire to control both the known and unknown areas of the world. As a result, 32,000 individuals who wanted to think differently about religion were officially tortured and executed by the Church. Spreading this dreadful version of Christianity was not only one motivation for the Age of Discovery, it was also a very good excuse to use when the real motivations were things far more basic and less Christian: conquest, slavery and greed. The Spanish and Portuguese empires were built on religious fanaticism and conquest, slavery, spices, gold, silver, emeralds and tobacco. It has been said that the Spanish took the gold and silver of the Americas and turned them into stone, building huge cathedrals, castles and fortresses across southern Spain. So the Age of Discovery was not about finding the great Southland, but European ships were now sailing the waters of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. In 1580, the matter of Portuguese-Spanish ownership of new lands became further complicated by the fact that, as a result of a royal marriage, Portugal and Spain became one unified kingdom, the Iberian Union. Under the Habsburg rulers Philip II, III and IV, this situation lasted until 1640. By the time this happened, however, it had become apparent that there was another problem with papal decrees and the treaties of Tordesillas and Zaragoza. Some nations simply ignored them. Corporate raiders. The Protestants take to the sea. The two nations that ignored the papal decrees most vehemently were England and the Netherlands. Both of these nations broke from the Catholic Church and the control of the Pope in the 16th century. Henry VIII established the Church of England with himself as its head, when Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy in 1534. When the Spanish invasion of England failed in 1588 during the reign of Henry's daughter Elizabeth I, England was free to establish itself as a major seafaring nation. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe from 1577 to 1580 and was the second captain to do so. He attacked and plundered Spanish colonies and ships along the west coast of South America and explored the west coast of California, which he claimed for Elizabeth I. Thomas Cavendish emulated Drake's feats in 1586 to 88. Both were knighted for their efforts as part of the war against Spain. The Dutch situation was different. The Netherlands had been ruled by Burgundy and became part of the Habsburg Empire by royal marriage and thus under Spanish sovereignty until 1581, when the northern region, which had adopted Protestant Calvinism, declared independence in what was known as the Dutch Revolt. This occurred as part of what is known as the 80 Years' War, or Dutch War of Independence, 1568 to 1648. In effect, the northern Netherlands acted as the Dutch Republic from 1588. The Dutch, at war with their Spanish rulers but now operating as an independent nation, did not take long to start exploring and challenging Portugal for access to the Spice Islands. The first Dutch fleet to the East Indies, 4 ships financed by 7 different merchant companies, sailed in 1595. Then, in 1598, Olivier van Noort left Rotterdam with 4 ships to harass the Spanish in the Philippines and attempt to open trade with China. Entering the Pacific through the Straits of Magellan, he lost 2 ships, but sank the galleon San Antonio near Manila and made it home with 1 ship and 45 of his original 248 men. In 1601, a fleet of 13 Dutch vessels belonging to different merchant companies and sailing under 2 different admirals made its way to Bantam on the island of Java. And part of the fleet, 5 Dutch vessels commanded by Admiral Walter Harmens, fought a pitched sea battle with a Portuguese and Spanish fleet made up of 8 galleons and many smaller ships. The Dutch won a decisive victory and captured 3 ships. The smallest of Harmens's 5 vessels, a messenger ship called the Duifken, would later play a major role in Australia's history. The Dutch States General, the ruling body that represented the 7 Netherland provinces, realised that fleets of ships belonging to various merchant companies and ship owners with more than one admiral or decision-maker were prone to many problems. A more unified and disciplined approach was required. Across the North Sea, in England, Queen Elizabeth I was thinking the exact same thing. As early as 1579, Sir Francis Drake's voyage around the world plundering Spanish ships and colonies had added substantially to the royal treasury and returned a massive 5,000% profit to investors. After the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, Queen Elizabeth gave her blessing to several expeditions into Spanish and Portuguese-controlled waters. In 1592, an expedition organised by the Earl of Cumberland, led by Sir Walter Raleigh and made up of ships owned by various adventurers, merchants and captains, captured several enemy vessels, including a carrack, the Madre de Dios, Mother of God, in a sea battle near the island of Flores in the Azores. The Madre de Dios was 3 times larger than any British vessel ever built at the time, and caused a sensation when she was brought back to Dartmouth. In her holds were chests filled with jewels, pearls, gold, silver coins, ambergris, ebony, cochineal, cloth and tapestries. She was also carrying huge amounts of spices, including nutmeg, pepper, cinnamon, frankincense and cloves. Also on board the vessel was a book that contained information about trade with India, China and Japan. The capture of the Madre de Dios changed the course of British history and provided a dilemma for Elizabeth I. Here, in one vessel, was treasure equal to half of the annual royal revenue of her kingdom. On the other hand, there was no prescribed way of dividing the spoils, and arguments developed between the various ship owners and captains. Much of the precious cargo was stolen or misappropriated by those who had been involved in the expedition. Elizabeth realised that there had to be better methods for the Crown to benefit from some form of control over the revenue from such expeditions. It was time to find a new way to access the riches of the Indies. The old European ideas of spreading Catholicism, colonising and plundering were about to be replaced by a new greed, commercial trading monopolies, and 200 years of war between European powers. The VOC and British East India Company. Out there on a lawless ocean, there were enemy ships as well as pirates. Spain and Portugal were now united under one king, had established colonies in Africa, America and Asia, and were at war with both England and the Netherlands. Individual merchants or small groups of merchants who sent ships on speculative trading missions to distant parts of the world risked losing everything on one voyage. In 1600, Elizabeth I gave a monopoly by royal charter to explore, trade and attack enemy ships and territories in the East Indies to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, which became the English East India Company, later the British East India Company, often simply called the Company. At the peak of its powers in the 18th century, the company controlled more than half of all the trade in the entire world and ruled over India and other parts of what would become the British Empire with its own army and fleet of ships. Any merchants trading in breach of the charter without a licence from the company were liable to indefinite imprisonment at the royal pleasure, and all their ships and cargoes would be forfeited in equal parts to the Crown and the English East India Company. The charter, originally for 15 years, was renewed by all reigning British monarchs until 1858, when the British government took over the company's Indian possessions, its administrative powers, its property, its army and its empire, and the company was dissolved. Although the English East India Company was established 2 years before the Dutch version, it would be the Dutch East India Company, Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, that was the first of the two organisations to make a major impact on the history of Australia. Established on the 20th of March 1602, the VOC has been accurately described by the American author Peter Gelderloos as a chartered company, the first with publicly traded stocks, and within a few decades of its foundation, the richest company in the world. The VOC was not merely a business interest. It constituted a state in itself. By 1669, it commanded over 200 ships, a quarter of them warships, and 10,000 soldiers. The Dutch state had granted the VOC lawmaking, war-making, and judicial authority. It founded colonies that proved to be fully functioning, if not fully independent, states that lasted for centuries. Both the VOC and British East India Company espoused the concept of mare liberum, freedom of the seas, in direct defiance of the mare clausum, the right to close the ocean to others, that was claimed by the Spanish and Portuguese and originated in the papal decrees of 1498 and 1529. Mare liberum provided ideological justification for the VOC, equipped with superior vessels and armaments to end the Portuguese control of the spice trade. After decades of war, a peace settlement in 1663 left the VOC in possession of the Cape Colony in Africa and most of the Spice Islands. The Portuguese were left with Brazil, colonies in Africa, and only small footholds in Asia, Goa in India, East Timor, and Macau. The English East India Company used the conflict as an opportunity to send vessels and establish contacts in India and the Spice Islands while the other two powers were at war and distracted. By 1700, the English East India Company and the VOC had gained control of Far Eastern trade from India to Japan. Who wants New Holland? The winds of change. With the Netherlands now a dominant power in the Spice Islands, the VOC's main problem was the length of the voyage to the islands around Africa and across the northern Indian Ocean. This problem was solved in 1611 when VOC Captain Heinrich Brouwer ventured further south of the Cape Peninsula instead of following the coast and rounding the bottom of Africa, and discovered the strong westerly winds called the Roaring Forties. These powerful air currents are caused by air being displaced from the equator into latitudes 40 to 50 degrees south. This, combined with the effect of the Earth's rotation and the lack of any significant land mass to block the flow, causes the strong prevailing westerlies. By following these winds across the Southern Ocean and then turning north, the time for the journey was cut in half. The problem then, however, was to accurately calculate longitude and decide when to turn north. Before the invention of accurate chronometers, calculating longitude was done by dead reckoning, which was inaccurate and little better than guesswork. In spite of this problem, in 1616 the VOC made it compulsory for all its captains to use the new route. One result of this directive was increased profits for the VOC, as sailing time was reduced and more voyages could be made. On the other hand, several valuable ships and cargoes were lost when VOC vessels ran aground or sank after hitting reefs or the shore along the coast of Western Australia. Another incidental consequence of captains being instructed to use the Brower or southern route was, of course, the discovery and mapping of much of the continent that became Australia. In 1616, Dirk Hartog, captain of the VOC vessel Eintracht, Concord, lost contact with the fleet in a storm, and on the 25th of October 1616 anchored near an island just off the west coast of Australia at Shark Bay. Hartog explored the island for 3 days and left a pewter plate nailed to a tree as evidence of his discovery. He named the coast Eintrachtsland. The name Eintracht was a common one for Dutch ships, referring to the successful alliance of the 7 provinces that made up the Dutch Republic. Just over a year before Hartog's landing, another vessel of that name, captained by Willem Schouten, had made the first ever pass under Cape Horn and sighted a land to the southeast, which he named Statenland, in honour of the Parliament of the 7 provinces of the Netherlands, the Staten-Generaal. Schouten wondered whether the land was part of the Great Southland's southwestern extremity. 27 years later, in 1642, Abel Tasman found New Zealand, and considered the possibility that it was a western extension of Statenland, so he gave it the same name. 1 year later, Heinrich Brouwer proved Statenland under South America was an island, so Dutch mapmakers changed Tasman's Statenland to Nova Zealandia, New Zealand, after the Dutch province of Zealand. A number of large VOC ships with valuable trade cargoes and passengers were wrecked along the coast of Western Australia in the following century, most notably the Batavia in 1629, the Verguldrach, Gilt Dragon, in 1656, the Ridderschap van Holland, Knighthood of Holland, in 1694, and the Zuiddorp, South Village, in 1712. In 1696, Willem de Vlaming commanded an extensive search with 3 ships, looking for survivors of the Ridderschap van Holland, a vessel that had carried 324 passengers. He explored and charted hundreds of miles of coastline, including Rottnest Island, the Swan River and Shark Bay, found Hartog's plate and replaced it with one of his own. In May 1626, De Gulten Zipgert, the Golden Seahorse, departed Amsterdam with Pieter van Nuits, a member of the VOC's India Council, on board. Instead of turning north, the ship continued east and mapped 1,500 kilometres of the Australian southern coast to near modern-day Ceduna. Francois Thiessen, the captain of the ship, named the region Land van Pieter Nuits, Peter Nuits Land, as Nuits was the highest-ranking VOC official on the ship. We still have Nuits Reef, Cape Nuits, and the Nuits Archipelago, and Western Australian Christmas bush is named Nuitsia floribunda. On the north coast, the Duifken, which had taken part in the sea battle at Bantam in December 1601, was now a VOC vessel captained by Willem Janszoon. Duifken was a 3-masted, manoeuvrable vessel of about 100 tons that was used as a scouting and messenger vessel. She had a shallow draft and could carry cargoes of up to 60 tons. Often named Duif or Duifken, these vessels carried small cargoes between ports and were used to scout coastlines and survey new territories. The names, meaning dove and little dove, were a reference to the dove sent by Noah to scout for land and check for signs that the world was safe after the flood. In 1603, the Doifken became the first European vessel to explore the coast of Australia, although Captain Jansoon thought he was exploring and mapping part of New Guinea when he made the first maps of the west coast of Cape York. After Francois Thyssen mapped a large portion of the south coast, it seemed that this landmass was not part of the fabled Great Southland. In 1642, VOC Captain Abel Tasman was sent by the company with 2 ships, Heemskerk and Zeehan, to search the Southern Ocean below 40 degrees south. In August 1642, Tasman left Mauritius, headed south and turned east. He discovered Tasmania, which he named Van Diemen's Land, in honour of the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, charted the southern half of the island and sailed east, where he found and charted the west coast of New Zealand before sailing back to Batavia via Tonga and Fiji. He had circumnavigated the Australian continent without once seeing the mainland. The following year, Tasman, following explorations 20 years earlier by VOC captains Jan Christensen and Willem Justin van Kolstedt, charted the north and west coasts of the continent, from Cape York to just north of Shark Bay. Dutch cartographer Johan Bleur produced a map labelling the whole landmass officially Nova Hollandia, New Holland, in 1663. From that time, all accurate maps of the world showed about 3/4 of the coast of New Holland, with open sea to the east and south. It was obvious that it was not the Great Southland. Why didn't the Dutch ever claim or settle New Holland? Well, the answer can be found in the report by Jan Christensen after his 1623 exploration of Cape York and the Gulf of Carpentaria, where his crew fought a pitched battle with some 200 local tribesmen. The people, who he described as poor and miserable, had no knowledge of precious metals or spices. These Dutch captains, like those of the British East India Company, belonged to a commercial enterprise. They were interested in trade. They had no interest in establishing settlements that could not make profits. After William Dampier called in at Timor in 1699, the VOC became wary of British interest and sent expeditions to both New Holland and New Guinea in 1705 to make sure there was nothing there that made the territories worth claiming or settling. The Martin van Delft expedition spent 3 months on the Tiwi Islands and north coast of New Holland, near present-day Darwin, studying the locals and trading. Van Delft, who died on the return voyage, concluded they were primitive and treacherous people. Similarly, the New Guinea expedition, led by Jacob Weiland, found nothing worthy of interest to the VOC. These were the final attempts by the VOC to find any reason to settle or claim New Holland or New Guinea. This ends CD 2. CD 3. The British are coming. The first English East India Company captain to use the Brouwer route was Humphrey Fitzherbert, who helped establish an English enclave at Table Bay at the Cape of Good Hope. The second English East India Company ship to attempt the route was the ill-fated Trial, the first British ship to sight the coast of New Holland, captained by John Brooke in 1622. Carrying a valuable cargo of silver for trading purposes and precious gifts for the King of Siam, present-day Thailand, the vessel travelled too far east and ran onto a reef near Barrow Island and sank. Brooke had misread Dutch charts and later blamed Fitzherbert for giving him inaccurate information. With his son and 9 others, he took what he could of the treasures on board, scrambled into the ship's skiff, abandoned the rest of the crew, and sailed to Batavia. To cover his ineptitude and cowardice, he lied about the circumstances of the wreck and location of the reef, making it appear the ship was lost further west. Meanwhile, the ship's factor, head merchant, Thomas Bright, managed to get 44 men and the ship's longboat ashore on one of the Montebello Islands. A week later, they set sail and reached Batavia 3 days after Brooke. 90 men drowned in the shipwreck. Bright wrote a report blaming Brooke for the wreck and loss of life, and investigations were carried out, but Brooke was cleared of blame. 300 years later, in 1934, the true position of the trial rocks was calculated by historian Ida Lee, and the wreck was found in 1969, proving Brooke was guilty as charged. However, as a result of the wreck, English East India Company ships were banned from using the faster Brouwer route for several decades, and there was no significant British contact with the coast of New Holland until the arrival of William Dampier, an adventurer, botanist, anthropologist and hydrographer who managed to circumnavigate the world 3 times in his lifetime. In 1688, as a member of the crew of the pirate ship Cygnet, Dampier spent 3 months exploring the land around the Fitzroy River in Western Australia while the ship was being repaired. His book, A New Voyage Round the World, published in 1697, was a bestseller, and so impressed the British Admiralty that, in an unprecedented move, they gave him captaincy of a naval vessel, the 26-gun warship HMS Roebuck, and sent him in January 1699 to find the east coast of New Holland and explore the continent. As it was midwinter, however, entry into the Pacific via Tierra del Fuego was impossible. So the Roebuck went via the Cape of Good Hope and Indian Ocean to Shark Bay and followed the coast north and east. Dampier charted the coast and also made the first detailed scholarly records and drawings of Australian flora and fauna and seashells. After visiting the Dutch port at Timor for supplies, he charted the north coast of New Guinea, New Ireland and New Britain. He sailed within 700 kilometres of the east coast of Australia, but with the Roebuck leaking badly with worm-eaten timbers, Dampier abandoned the voyage and attempted to return to England via Cape Horn. He made it as far as Ascension Island in the South Atlantic, where in February 1701, with the Roebuck about to sink, he ran her aground in an attempt to save his collection of specimens, charts and papers. 5 weeks later, an East Indiaman arrived and all were rescued. The specimens and drawings are in the Fielding Druce Herbarium at Oxford University. Dampier's account of the expedition, A Voyage to New Holland, was published in 1703. In 2001, a team from the Western Australian Maritime Museum located the wreck of HMS Roebuck in Clarence Bay at Ascension Island. None of this exploration, however interesting it may be in the history of Australia, had anything to do with attempting to find the Great Southland. It would take another 70 years and a world war before the race to find the Great Southland began in earnest. Meanwhile, between 1740 and 1743, Commodore George Anson circumnavigated the globe during the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739 to 1748. This war, over trading rights in the Caribbean, started when Welsh merchant captain Robert Jenkins was accused of smuggling and had his ear removed by a Spanish Coast Guard commander. Anson set out with 6 warships and 2 storeships on a poorly planned mission to the Pacific. After only 2 months at sea, dysentery and typhus spread among the crews, and later scurvy appeared as they battled to reach the Pacific under Cape Horn in gales and ice. 2 ships became separated from the fleet and turned back. 1 ship was wrecked on the coast of Chile, and 2 were lost at sea. Anson sacked the Spanish port of Paita, 1,100 kilometres north of Lima, captured several Spanish ships, and headed across the Pacific. Most of the men died of scurvy, but one ship, HMS Centurion, made it to Macau, where it was refitted. Anson intercepted, attacked, and captured the Acapulco galleon, Nuestra Señora de Covadonga, Our Lady of Covadonga, as it neared the Philippines, carrying 35 tons of silver coins and ingots. Anson sailed home a hero, with 188 of the original 1,854 men who had set out almost 4 years earlier. 166 of the more than 600 men from the 2 ships that turned back and the one wrecked on the coast of Chile also made it home. He had lost 5 ships and 1,500 men, but his share of the prize money made him one of the wealthiest men in Britain. Promoted to Admiral and elected to Parliament, his 1748 account, A Voyage Round the World in the years 1740 to 1744, included charts captured from Spanish vessels that contained quite a lot of misinformation about the Pacific, including phantom islands and bits of coastlines, which later caused Alexander Dalrymple and others to make false assumptions about the Great Southland. Anson, who became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1751, suggested a British settlement on the Falkland Islands, as they were conveniently located to be used as a base for exploring the Pacific. His plan was not implemented, for fear it could cause yet another war with the Spanish. Britain's next major war would, however, change the world forever and lead to a race to claim the Falklands and explore the Pacific. Et les Français? Gonville Land and New France. France, as a Catholic nation that had taken no part in the treaties of Tordesillas and Zaragoza, had no religious legal rights to explore unknown seas or claim territories. It was left to individual French shipowners to advocate the idea of freedom of the seas and explore them with the tacit approval of expansionist French monarchs Louis XII, 1498 to 1515, and François I, 1515 to 1547. In 1503, a ship owner from Honfleur, Bino Palmier de Gonville, defied the Portuguese mare clausum and, with the help of 2 Portuguese pilots, set sail for the Spice Islands in his ship L'Espoir, Hope. South of the Cape of Good Hope, they were driven in a great storm for 6 weeks to a land where the natives lived in peace and farmed crops. Gonville and his crew stayed there for 6 months before returning home with a native boy, the son of a local ruler. The boy later married into the Palmier family, and 160 years later, his great-grandson, Jean Palmier de Courton, canon of the Church of Saint-Pierre at Lisieux, wrote an account of the voyage, and in 1667 published a small book, Mémoires touchant l'établissement d'une mission chrétienne dans le troisième monde, Memoirs concerning the establishment of a Christian mission in the Third World, which called upon France to find, Christianize and colonize La Terre Australe, the land of his ancestors. Historians generally agree that Palmier de Gonville landed in the southern part of Brazil. As a result of this story, however, the French name for the mythical Great Southland became Gonville Land, and was often also referred to as Le Troisième Monde, the Third World. The French belief in this land led to writers like Gabriel de Goignet using it as a setting for utopian fantasy adventure stories in the form of accounts of real voyages. Because of the papal restrictions and Portuguese control, the French were slow to establish colonies in the East Indies. They were, however, busy elsewhere. Between 1534 and 1542, Jacques Cartier made 3 voyages from Saint-Malo, explored the coast of Canada and the St. Lawrence River, and claimed the land for France. It became the first province of New France, and in 1608, Samuel de Champlain started a settlement at Quebec, which was the beginning of a huge French empire in North America. We tend to forget that before the 7 Years' War, New France covered an area more than 4 times larger than the territory controlled by the British in North America. After the French East India Company was finally formed in 1664 and a trading post was established in India in 1668, one of their captains, Bouvet de Lozier, searching for Gonville land in 1739, found, in a sea of ice and fog at latitude 54 degrees south, Bouvet Island, the only speck of land in the vast South Atlantic. He reported that trade appeared unlikely, as there was no sign of habitation. Bougainville, the 7 Years' War, and the Falklands fiasco. Louis-Antoine Lecomte de Bougainville was a French nobleman, diplomat, mathematician, army colonel, and navy admiral, and a dedicated enemy of Britain. Although, while he was attached to the French embassy in London in 1755, he became a member of the Royal Society at the age of 27, after the publication of his Treatise on Integral Calculus. A year later, he was commanding French troops against the British in Canada. The 7 Years' War actually lasted 9 years, from 1754 to 1763, and began in, of all places, Ohio, as a border dispute between French and British colonists. This war changed the world drastically and had a major impact on Australian history. It intensified the race to find the Great Southland, which didn't exist, and the east coast of New Holland, which did. Britain's allies included the German kingdoms of Prussia, Hesse, Hanover, Brunswick, and Schaumburg, as well as Portugal and the Native American nations of the Iroquois and Cherokee. On the French side were Austria, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Saxony, the Mughal Empire, and the Native American Wabanaki, Algonquin, Mohawk, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Shawnee nations. The war was fought in Europe, North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, Africa, India, the Spice Islands, the Philippines, and on the waters of the Mediterranean North Sea and the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. After 9 years of fighting and negotiating, the French lost New France and almost all their other overseas territories to Britain. This was a devastating blow to French colonial aspirations, and in the aftermath, their search for new territories to claim and colonise became almost frantic, as did British attempts to counter the French aspirations. Bougainville took part as a commanding officer in the pivotal Battle of Quebec, which ended in a humiliating defeat for the French and the surrender of Quebec to the British. A 30-year-old midshipman named James Cook was instrumental in the charting and navigating that enabled the French fleet to carry troops along the St. Lawrence River and capture the city. Bougainville helped negotiate the surrender of both Quebec and Montreal, as well as the terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and then quickly set about planning to re-establish France as a world power by exploring and acquiring new territories. After the 7 Years' War, lying, spying, and subterfuge about discoveries and maps, which had always been standard practice, reached new levels of paranoia between the French and British. Even before the peace treaty was signed, Bougainville began hatching a plan with French Foreign Minister le Duc de Choiseul to secretly establish a French colony on the uninhabited Île Malouine, Falkland Islands, and use it as a base to explore the Pacific. This involved taking volunteers, mostly refugees from the North American maritime province of Acadia, who had refused to sign British loyalty oaths, and settle the islands and claim them for France by act of first settlement. Bougainville personally funded the whole operation. This plan was the same one proposed by George Anson in 1748. As European nations had no idea what islands or continents existed in the Pacific, the Falklands were the only known strategic base for exploration. Bougainville, a colonel in the French army, was quickly made a captain in the French navy in June 1763 and left in September from Saint-Malo with 2 ships and 29 settlers. He established the Port St. Louis colony in February and officially claimed the islands in April, making his cousin Michel François de Neuville governor. Louis XV formally ratified possession on the 12th of September 1764, and Bougainville took another 50 settlers to Port St. Louis in October, and then visited Tierra del Fuego to collect timber, as the Falklands were virtually treeless, before returning to France in August 1765. When the British Admiralty got wind of what the French were up to in March 1764, a secret expedition was hastily organised by the Secretary to the Lords of the Admiralty, Sir Philip Stephens, the most powerful person in the organisation. The Lords of the Admiralty left decision-making to Stephens and often didn't know what he and his staff were planning. It was usually new ways to thwart French colonial ambitions. Britain had previously claimed the Falkland Islands by act of discovery in 1592 by Captain John Davis and Sir Richard Hawkins in 1593. Englishman John Strong and his crew were the first people known to land on and explore the islands in 1690. As soon as Stephens at the Admiralty had news of the French enterprise, the British frigates HMS Dolphin and Tamar were hastily prepared and sailed on the 3rd of July to reassert the British claims to the Falkland Islands and California, and search for the Great Southland under the command of Foul-Weather Jack, Commander John Byron. The expedition was disguised as a voyage to India, and not even the crews knew the true purpose until the ships left Rio de Janeiro for the Falklands. In mid-January 1765, Byron found a good harbour on Saunders Island, which he named Port Egmont, and in a ceremony on the 22nd of January he re-established the British claim to the islands. Unknown to Byron, 120 kilometres to the east on East Falkland Island, the French colony at Port St. Louis was almost a year old. Byron had been ordered to survey the islands, but due to foul weather, he quit before finding the French and sailed to Port Famine in the Straits of Magellan to rendezvous with the store ship HMS Florida, which arrived back in London in June with Byron's maps and a report that a strange ship had followed him to Port Famine flying French colours. It was Bougainville on his wood-collecting expedition. In September 1765, the Admiralty dispatched Captain John McBride with 3 ships, a prefabricated wooden blockhouse, and 25 marines to make a permanent settlement at Port Egmont, survey the islands and map them. Over a year later, in December 1766, McBride finally found the French at Port St. Louis. He politely asked them to leave, and they politely refused. Meanwhile, back in Paris in August 1765, Bougainville had discovered that owing to complaints from Spain and the formal family agreement, Pacte de Famille, between the Bourbon kings of France and Spain, who were cousins, the islands were to be formally handed over to Spain. Bougainville was paid a massive compensation of 600,000 livres, about £25,000, and the settlement was handed to Spain and renamed Puerto de Nuestra Señora de la Soledad, Port of Our Lady of Solitude. On the 6th of December 1766, Bougainville left France on his secret expedition to become the first Frenchman to circumnavigate the globe and explore the Pacific. The voyage was disguised as a visit to the Falklands to formally hand over the colony to the Spanish and evacuate settlers wanting to leave. Once this was done, the Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas, became an Anglo-Spanish problem, and Bougainville went to search for new French territories and the east coast of New Holland. South Pacific Secrets. Tahiti and beyond. After Commander John Byron reclaimed the Falklands and was reprovisioned by the Florida, he negotiated the Straits of Magellan, entered the Pacific in late April 1765 and sailed home via the Mariana Islands and Batavia. He just missed Tahiti, but found several islands to the northeast and named them after King George. Although his secret orders were to look for the Great Southland and reinforce the British claim to America's northwest coast made by Francis Drake in 1579, he failed to do either, claiming his ships were in poor condition. He reported huge flocks of birds heading south, which suggested the possible existence of the Great Southland. After the fastest circumnavigation to that date, Byron arrived home on the 7th of May 1766, and Sir Philip Stephens made sure all the officers' journals were seized by the Admiralty and all crew members were made to swear a vow of secrecy in front of a judge. Apparently, however, there was a French agent in the Admiralty, and Byron's log and maps were copied and sent to Paris. The race to explore the Pacific was now on in earnest. The Admiralty, fearing that the French were possibly one step ahead, had the Dolphin refitted and sent back to the Pacific less than 4 months later, on the 22nd of August, under the command of Captain Samuel Wallis. The second vessel on the voyage, HMS Swallow, was under the command of Philip Carteret, who had sailed with Byron, as had at least 7 of the crew members of the 2 ships. After suffering dreadful weather in the Straits of Magellan for 4 months, Wallis lost contact with the Swallow and entered the Pacific on the 11th of April 1767. He attempted to follow orders and sail west to where Abel Tasman had charted the west coast of New Zealand, but weather and sickness among the crew made it impossible. With the ship undermanned, Wallis turned north, then west, and found Tahiti. By then he was seriously ill and bedridden with bilious attacks, and Second Lieutenant Tobias Furneaux was in command of the day-to-day running of the ship. Several days before making landfall at Tahiti, some of the crew thought they saw land to the south. As this was in the same area that Byron had reported seeing large flocks of birds flying south, this fueled more speculation about a southern continent. The first attempt to make a landing on Tahiti met with such hostility from the locals that the ship's cannons were fired, and the Dolphin retreated, sailed around the island, and found a safe haven on the north side, at Matavai Bay, on the 23rd of June 1767. Tobias Furneaux exchanged emblems of peace with a local chieftain and conducted a possession ceremony, naming the island King George III Island. During the 5-week stay at Matavai Bay, the crew, including Wallis, were restored to health, and the Dolphin made the same passage home as previously, arriving on the 6th of May, 1768, with news of the discovery of Tahiti, just 80 days before the Endeavour was due to sail to the Pacific to observe the transit of Venus. Meanwhile, back in October 1766, Bougainville had received formal permission from Louis XV for his proposed expedition to search the Pacific and circumnavigate the globe, partly as compensation for the Falkland Islands Îles Malouines, Islas Malvinas fiasco. His 2 vessels entered the Pacific in late January 1768. His written instructions from King Louis XV did not mention the Great Southland. He was instructed to search for and claim, if possible, the lands lying between the Indies and the western shores of America, called Demon Land, New Holland, Carpentaria, Land of the Holy Spirit, New Guinea, etc. It is uncertain whether or not Bougainville was in possession of the information stolen from the British Admiralty, but he followed a similar path to that taken by John Byron. Unlike Byron, however, Bougainville found Tahiti, and anchored in a lagoon on the east coast, about 20 coastal kilometres from where Wallis had anchored 10 months previously. Bougainville assumed he was the first European to find the island and claimed it for France. Due to the difficult anchorage, they lost 6 anchors in 9 days, Bougainville set sail after only 10 days at Tahiti, taking with him the local chief's brother, Ahu Turu, who volunteered to accompany the foreigners to their homeland. Bougainville found the Samoan Islands, then headed to Vanuatu, and quickly proved that De Quiros's Australia del Espiritu Santo was just another chain of islands, which he claimed for France. He then crossed the Coral Sea with a specific intention, as stated in his journal, to verify our conjectures by getting sight of the eastern coast of New Holland. On the 4th of June, 1768, 8 days out of Vanuatu, the Bordeaux and L'Etoile were confronted by a line of huge waves breaking on a submerged reef that Bougainville named Diana Reef. The next day, fruit and wood were seen in the sea, and Bougainville noted, "I have no doubt that there is land south-southeast of us." On the 6th of June, the ships encountered a line of shoals and reefs stretching to the horizon north and south. It was obviously a massive coastal reef. Bougainville was sure that this land is nothing else than the eastern coast of New Holland. The first version of the map of the voyage, produced by Ceylon and Nyon in Paris in 1771, shows an arc of Australian coastline to the south of the line of the voyage that looks vaguely like the coast from Point Melville to Cairns, and dotted reefs to the west and southwest. A second edition of the map contradicts this and shows instead a small piece of coastline to the north of the most easterly position of the voyage, at which point Bougainville turned northward. Both versions of the chart are obviously mere guesswork, but Bougainville was certain he had found the east coast of New Holland, and although he never saw the coast, he was right. Evidently, some crew members claimed to see land from the mast tops, but that is highly unlikely. The original charts were made by the expedition's cartographer, Charles Routier de Romainville. Bougainville never made a chart in his life. We don't know how many engravers and copiers made approximations before they were published. Fearing scurvy, which had already taken some of his crew, and faced with a seemingly impenetrable barrier, with only a few weeks' fresh water left and enough food for 3 months, Bougainville's choice was now to turn south into the unknown, or north, where he knew there was land. Louis XV had ordered Bougainville to search for Demon Land as well as New Guinea. As he stood the ship safely away from the seemingly endless reefs, Bougainville said he heard La Voix de Dieu, the voice of God, in the roar of the breakers, and it said, "Go north." Bougainville did so, and was the first European to find the largest and most northerly of the Solomon Islands, which still bears his name. After exploring the same islands that Dampier had studied 70 years earlier, the expedition returned home via Batavia. In retrospect, Bougainville made two mistakes. Firstly, he turned north instead of south at the critical moment, and secondly, he failed to make any French claim on the east coast. He did, however, establish that there was ocean between the east coast of New Holland and Australia del Espiritu Santo, Vanuatu. The previous French maps showing New Holland bulging eastward from Cape York to incorporate the islands of Vanuatu could now be corrected, and the French now knew where the east coast of New Holland was, and the British didn't, but they would within a year. Mr. Dalrymple's theory. Both the Admiralty and the British East India Company were interested in the possibility of the existence of the Great Southland. The Admiralty for strategic and logistic reasons, and shareholders of British East India Company for commercial reasons. If the continent existed, it was important to find it before the French. The main advocate of the possibility of the existence of the Great Southland was Alexander Dalrymple, a man who spent most of his working life with the British East India Company. Dalrymple was born into a noble Scottish family in 1737 on the family estate Newhales, near Edinburgh. He was the seventh of 16 children born by Lady Christian Hamilton, a daughter of the Earl of Haddington, to her husband, Lieutenant Colonel Sir James Dalrymple. After his father died, his mother's family connections secured Alexander a job with the East India Company in Madras at just 15 years of age. The ambitious young man enthusiastically explored the seas and islands between Borneo and the Philippines and visited Canton. He negotiated a trade deal with the Muslim Sultanate of Sulu, which governed parts of Borneo and Mindanao south of the Philippines, to set up a trading station on the island of Balambangan. As part of the 7 Years' War, a British fleet captured the city of Manila and surrounding areas in the Philippines in 1762. The city was governed by the British East India Company for 2 years before being returned to Spain as part of the Treaty of Paris at the end of the war. During those 2 years, documents relating to the exploration of the Pacific found in the Manila Library were given to Dalrymple to translate. Among them, the long-hidden account of Luis Vaez de Torres' voyage, which told of a passage south of New Guinea from the Pacific Ocean to the Spice Islands. In 1765, Dalrymple was back in London, where the East India Company rejected his plans for the Balambangan trading station. He was, however, elected a Fellow of the Royal Society for his work mapping the Malay archipelago and researching exploration in the Pacific. His book, an account of the discoveries made in the South Pacific Ocean previous to 1764, was published in late 1768. But a shorter, earlier printing was made to support his ambition to lead the British expedition to the Pacific, to plot the transit of Venus across the face of the Sun in 1769 and explore the Southern Ocean. In 1764, Dalrymple proposed a theory about the Great Southland. His map shows the west coast of New Zealand, as charted by Abel Tasman, and an empty southern Pacific Ocean, stretching to a point about 1,550 kilometres east of the coast of Chile. At that point, at 40 degrees south latitude, Dalrymple shows a small stretch of eastern coastline, charted by Juan Fernandez. At latitude 50 degrees south on the same longitude, there's a small stretch of eastern coastline supposedly charted by the Dutch. Fernandez was a Spanish explorer who discovered the islands that bear his name, 670 kilometres off the coast of Santiago. The east coast fragment on Dalrymple's 1764 map lies 1,300 kilometres southwest of those islands and was supposedly charted when Fernandez was looking for the Great Southland. An account exists in the Spanish Naval Archive of an unofficial Fernandez voyage to a land rather like New Zealand. Dalrymple's map also shows, further northwest around latitude 30 degrees, just south of Easter Island, found by Dutchman Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, a line labelled Signs of Land. Dalrymple's theory was that the Great Southland stretched from New Zealand across the Pacific to where part of its east coast terminated at one, two, or all three of the aforementioned locations on his map. Supported by the Royal Society, Dalrymple was appointed in December 1767 to lead the Endeavour expedition. 4 months later, however, he was informed that only a Royal Navy officer could command an Admiralty vessel. He was offered the compromise of leading the scientific party but not commanding the ship. He bluntly refused and never forgave what he saw as the insult of being replaced by James Cook. Dalrymple accused Cook of plotting behind his back, but the man who wielded the real power at the Admiralty, Sir Philip Stevens, was not going to let a servant of the East India Company take charge of an expedition that had a secret Admiralty agenda. He needed a man who could keep secrets, a tough, capable officer who could discover what Byron and Wallace had not. In spite of having lost command of the expedition, Dalrymple made his maps available to Joseph Banks and expounded his theories to the wealthy young botanist, who had paid a small fortune, £10,000, to be allowed to join the expedition, along with an entourage of 4 artists, a fellow botanist, 4 servants, and 3 hunting dogs. The proof is in the sailing. The odd couple. Joseph Banks, who was just 25 years old when the expedition departed in August 1768, shared the Endeavour's great cabin with James Cook, who turned 40 as the Endeavour sailed down the Atlantic in November. During the voyage of almost 3 years, the two men had only a few minor disagreements and became lifelong friends. Cook had studied every account and map available: De Quiros, Fernandez, Tasman, Roggeveen, Schouten, Anson, Byron and Wallace. He studied the science of currents, winds and waves, and developed his own theory about a large, habitable continent in the South Pacific. He didn't believe it existed. Banks added more than 100 volumes to the library in the great cabin, including Dalrymple's maps and writings, other navigational material, and an entire library of botanical works. He was convinced by Dalrymple's theories and believed that they would discover a great continent in the South Pacific. The Endeavour passed under Cape Horn and entered the Pacific on the 25th of January 1769. To the great dismay of his crew, James Cook spent the next 10 days exploring the stormy seas as far south as 60 degrees latitude, making sure there was nothing there and almost touching the Antarctic Circle, before proceeding back and crossing to the north of where he had entered the Pacific. Cook then set a course more westerly than either Byron or Wallace and sailed northwest at an angle of some 45 degrees across the Pacific. It soon became obvious even to Banks that the Endeavour was now sailing in the wide open ocean across the area where Dalrymple believed the Great Southland existed. By this time, the scientists, officers and artists on board, and indeed many of the crew, had divided into two camps. On one side were the continent mongers, led by Joseph Banks. On the other side were Cook and the no-continenters. The debate was generally good-natured, but bets were made, and there was money at stake. After observing the transit of Venus at Tahiti, Cook once again sailed south of latitude 40 degrees, well under the latitude of New Zealand on Tasman's map, and found only open sea. He then zigzagged northwest and southwest, and found the northwest coast of the North Island of New Zealand on the 7th of October 1769. The continent mongers were ecstatic, believing that this was indeed a northern extremity of the Great Southland, which would stretch southwest across the area of the Pacific that the Endeavour had not explored. Cook, however, spent the next 6 months exploring, charting and circumnavigating New Zealand to prove that it was indeed two large islands and not the Great Southland. Sailing south of South Cape at the bottom of Stewart Island, Cook was sure that this was the southernmost land, a large hollow swell from the southwest ever since we had the last gale of wind from that quarter, makes one think there is no land in that direction. Banks admitted defeat, commenting that, although we hoped to make discoveries more interesting to trade at least than any we had yet made, we were obliged entirely to give up our first grand object, the southern continent. Cook's next objective, according to his secret orders, was to find the east coast of New Holland, which he did and charted it. The Endeavour arrived home in July 1771, and Cook left again in HMS Resolution in July 1772. In the meantime, the French, who realised full well that New Holland was not the Great Southland, were still looking for Gonville Land, alias Terra Australis, or Le Troisième Monde. Jean-François Marie de Surville crossed the South Pacific from New Zealand to Peru in 1770. Marc Joseph Marion de Freyne found the Prince Edward Islands and Crozet Island in the southern Indian Ocean in 1771. Yves-Joseph de Kerguelen Tremarec sailed from Mauritius with 2 vessels, found Kerguelen Island in 1772, and assumed it was the tip of Gonville Land. In July 1772, James Cook departed on his second circumnavigation of the world with the Resolution and Adventure. He sailed close to the Antarctic Circle, across the Atlantic, Indian and Pacific Oceans, and proved that the French discoveries were just barren islands. Although he never saw Antarctica, he was the first captain to cross the Antarctic Circle, which he did on 3 occasions to latitudes lower than the Antarctic continent, until the frozen ocean prevented him going any further. When Cook stated in the journal of his second voyage, "I have sailed further than any man and found nothing," he was not expressing disappointment. He was simply stating the fact that he had proved there was no Great Southland. The man who named Australia. It was more than 30 years after Cook proved beyond any doubt that the fabled Great Southland did not exist, that the idea of New Holland being referred to as the Great Southland, Terra Australis or Australia, developed, and it was due to Matthew Flinders. There were 2 reasons for Flinders' suggestion. Firstly, it was now certain that New Holland was the only habitable landmass of continental size entirely in the southern hemisphere. Secondly, Flinders had a somewhat delicate political dilemma with naming the landmass he had circumnavigated in 1801-02, because part of it was called New Holland and another part New South Wales. It is necessary, however, to geographical precision that so soon as New Holland and New South Wales were known to form one land, there should be a general name applicable to the whole. I have ventured upon the readoption of the original Terra Australis. There is no probability that any other detached body of land of nearly equal extent will ever be found in a more southern latitude. The name Terra Australis will, therefore, remain descriptive of the geographical importance of this country. Had I permitted myself any innovation upon the original term, it would have been to convert it into Australia, as being more agreeable to the ear, and an assimilation to the names of the other great portions of the earth. The real Terra Australis. Flinders was wrong about one thing. There was another large, detached body of land in the southern hemisphere, a real Terra Australis. It wasn't quite as big as Hunter had proposed in the 16th century and called Australia, but it was bigger than the one Flinders called Australia. It wasn't the fabled, inhabitable Great Southland people had imagined, but it was there. As Flinders had already misappropriated its name for the continent comprising New Holland and New South Wales, cartographers had to find another name for it. They called it Antarctica. In February 1819, British merchant William Smith sailed his ship the Williams well south of Cape Horn in order to catch the wind to sail northwest, and sighted some unknown islands. He reported this to Royal Navy officials on arrival at Valparaiso in Chile, and they chartered his ship and sent Lieutenant Edward Bransfield and Smith back to the islands. Bransfield landed on King George Island and took formal possession for Britain. The islands became known as the South Shetlands. On the 30th of January 1820, under Cape Horn, Bransfield sighted the northernmost tip of Antarctica at latitude 63 degrees 50 minutes south and longitude 60 degrees 30 minutes west. He followed the coast east and also found and claimed Elephant Island and Clarence Island for Britain. It just so happened that the Russian Bellingshausen expedition of 1819 to 21, also exploring below the Antarctic Circle, had sighted the coast of the continent just 2 days earlier, to the east and much further south, at 69 degrees 21 minutes 28 seconds south, longitude 2 degrees 14 minutes 50 seconds west, and marked it on their chart as an ice shelf. Fabian Gottlieb Benjamin von Bellingshausen, who, with Commander Mikhail Lazarev, circumnavigated Antarctica twice with 2 ships, the Vostok and Merny, had visited Sir Joseph Banks before setting out. Banks, as president of the Royal Society, had helped the expedition with maps, charts and advice, and the expedition used Sydney as a base. Bellingshausen never claimed to have discovered Antarctica, but a later study of his journal by British historian A.G. Jones in 1982 proved he was first to do so. So a gentlemanly soldier, explorer and scientist, born in the small Baltic state of Estonia and sailing for the Tsar of Russia, a nation that lies partly within the Arctic Circle, finally discovered the southernmost continent on the planet, Antarctica, the true Terra Australis. It was incognita no longer. Footnote 1. The de Vlaming Plate. In 1696, Willem de Vlaming commanded an expedition to Australia's west coast in 3 ships: Geelvink, Yellowfinch, Niptang, Nippers, and Veseltje, Little Weasel, to look for survivors of the Ridderschap van Holland, the knighthood of Holland, that had gone missing 2 years earlier, with 325 on board. He found Hartog's plate and replaced it with one that had been prepared in Batavia. Hartog's plate was sent to the VOC's headquarters in Holland. It is now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. In 1801, Captain Jacques Hamelin of the corvette Naturaliste on the Baudin expedition landed in Shark Bay. His second-in-command, Louis de Freycinet, went to Dirk Hartog Island and found de Vlaming's plate. Hamelin made a careful copy of the inscription and ordered it be returned to where it was found. In 1818, de Freycinet, on his own circumnavigation, returned to Shark Bay on the Uranie and recovered de Vlaming's plate to take to France for safekeeping. Although the Uranie was wrecked at the Falkland Islands on its return voyage, both de Freycinet and the de Vlaming plate survived the wreck. De Freycinet deposited the plate in the Académie Française on his return, and it was lost. A century later, in 1940, it was discovered on a storeroom bottom shelf among some old engraving plates. After the liberation of Paris, Australia requested its return as a goodwill gesture. In May 1947, the French ambassador presented it to Prime Minister Ben Chifley. It is in the Shipwrecks Galleries in the Maritime Museum in Fremantle. Footnote 2. Foul Weather Jack. The 18th century British press bestowed this nickname on Vice Admiral John Byron, who always seemed to encounter or be conservatively wary of sailing in bad weather. As a midshipman on HMS Wager on the Anson expedition, he survived shipwreck, mutiny, exposure in the harsh Patagonian winter, and 6 years of imprisonment and hardship before being one of only 10 men of a crew of 300 to return to England. He commanded a squadron in the 7 Years' War and defeated a French flotilla in the Battle of Restigouche. He was later Governor of Newfoundland. He was the grandfather of the poet and adventurer Lord George Gordon Byron and also Lord George Anson Byron, explorer and admiral. Footnote 3. The Falklands, Malvinas. Puerto de Nuestra Señora de la Soledad was abandoned in 1812, and although the population over the 44 years of its existence only averaged around 60, mostly convicts, Puerto Soledad managed to have 21 different governors. Spain's and Argentina's subsequent claim to the Falkland Islands is based on the fact that France, who claimed them by right of settlement, officially handed them to Spain. The Spanish name for the islands, Islas Malvinas, is a translation of the French Îles Malouines, the islands of Malo, which derives from the French port of St. Malo, named after a 5th century Welsh missionary, one of 7 founding saints of Brittany. In June 1770, 5 armed ships and 1,400 soldiers arrived from Argentina, and the British were forced to leave the Falklands under a flag of truce. This incident was almost the tipping point for another major war. Britain demanded that the settlement be handed back, and after a flurry of diplomatic measures, the Spanish King Charles III declared, "Things shall be restored in the Malouines at the port called Egmont, precisely to the state in which they were before the 10th of June 1770. The King added that this could not affect the question of the prior right of sovereignty of the Malouine Islands, otherwise called Falkland Islands. The French Foreign Minister, the Duc de Choiseul, who had been using the situation to attempt to drag Spain into a war against Britain, was sacked and banished from court and from Paris. The British returned to Port Egmont in September 1771 and abandoned it in April 1774, leaving only a flag flying and an inscription on the blockhouse stating Britain's claim to the islands. In the interim, islands had been found and claimed in the Pacific, which rendered the base camp on the Falkland Islands much less important. 20 years after Puerto Soledad was abandoned, Captain James Onslow of HMS Clio reasserted Britain's claim, and the islands were colonised by Britain in the 1840s. Footnote 4. French attempts to find the Great Southland, 1769 to 73. Jean-François Marie de Surville. Sailing for the French East India Company in 1769, he left India, visited the Solomons and New Zealand, ran into cultural problems with the locals, and sailed to Peru with a Maori chieftain on board. Surville drowned attempting to get ashore in a small boat on the coast of Peru. Most of the crew and the Maori chief died of scurvy, but the ship made the port of Callao, and finally 66 of the original 173 crew reached the French island of Mauritius. Surville and James Cook passed within 2 days of each other, just north of New Zealand. Marc-Joseph Marion Dufresne, a French East India Company captain. In 1770, after the company was dissolved, he volunteered to partly fund a voyage of 2 ships to return the Tahitian Ahutoru, brought to France by Bougainville, to his homeland, and then search for Gonville Land. Ahutoru, however, died of smallpox within days of the ship's departing Mauritius. Dufresne found the Prince Edward and Crozet Islands in the South Indian Ocean in 1771 and made first European contact with Tasmanian Aborigines. In June 1772 he was attacked and killed at the Bay of Islands in New Zealand, along with 24 of his crew, by the previously friendly Maori. In reprisals, 250 Maori were killed. His second-in-command, Julien-Marie Crozet, took both vessels safely back to Mauritius via the Philippines. Crozet left a message in a bottle claiming New Zealand for France. Yves-Joseph de Kerguelen-Tremarec was sent in 1772 by Louis XV to find Gonville Land. At Mauritius he traded the ship he'd been given for the task, a 56-gun East Indiaman, for 2 armed store ships named Fortune and Gros Ventre, Big Belly. In the second week of February 1772 he found what is now known as Kerguelen Island, which he mistook for the continent of Gonville Land. 1 boat from each vessel was sent in very rough conditions to explore the island's southern bay and make charts. When a huge storm rolled in, Kerguelen-Tremarec, assuming there was a huge continent extending to the east and south of his ship and afraid of being wrecked on a lee shore, put out to sea, and when the Gros Ventre didn't appear after 2 days, he sailed back to Mauritius. The captain of the Gros Ventre, Louis-François Marie Alenot de Saint-Aloin, picked up the 2 boat crews, annexed the land for France, and then sailed east to the previously agreed rendezvous point at Cape Leeuwin, New Holland. When Kerguelen-Tremarec failed to arrive, Saint-Aloin followed the coast northward to Dirk Hartog Island, where, on the 30th of March 1772, one of his officers, Jean Mengot de la Hague, raised the French ensign, buried a bottle containing a document and 2 coins valued at 6 francs, and claimed the land for France. They sailed back to Mauritius via Timor and Batavia. As the Dutch had a prior claim due to discovery, the French needed to follow up their claim to New Holland by right of settlement, which they never quite managed to do. Both Saint-Aloin and de la Hague died, probably of fever or scurvy, in September 1772, a few days after reaching Mauritius. Kerguelen Tremarec, who had only observed what he claimed was Gonville land from his ship and never set foot on it, gave glowing reports to Louis XV and claimed to have discovered a continent. He was consequently sent on a second voyage and departed just before the Gros Ventre arrived home with the truth about the barren island. As a result, on his return, Kerguelen Tremarec was court-martialed and imprisoned. Freed during the French Revolution, he was given a ship by the revolutionary government to explore the southern oceans, but the ship was captured by a British privateer just after leaving France. He died in 1797. The Îles Kerguelen are also known in French as Les Îles de la Désolation. Part 3. Demythifying Captain Cook. What I tell you 3 times is true. The Hunting of the Snark, Lewis Carroll, 1876. Simplifying Captain Cook. When I was a kid in primary school, I heard what was probably the standard potted version of the story of Captain Cook's Endeavour voyage and the discovery of Australia. It went something like this. Captain Cook was a brave officer in the British Navy and a wonderful navigator. He decided to go exploring in the Pacific Ocean after he had taken some scientists to Tahiti so that they could observe an astronomical event that could be seen well from that position. He had chosen the Endeavour as being the best kind of ship to explore coastlines because he had worked as a sailor on similar cargo ships and colliers and wanted a ship with shallow draft that could sail in coastal water and be easily pulled ashore and repaired. He was looking for the Great Southland and discovered it when Lieutenant Hicks sighted the east coast of Australia. Cook was the first European explorer to sail along our east coast, which he called New South Wales. He didn't land until he reached a bay he called Botany Bay, where he gave his wife's nephew, Isaac Smith, the honour of stepping ashore first. There was a flat stone at Kurnell, marked as the landing place, and a sign told the story of Isaac stepping ashore. He sailed past Sydney Harbour and named it Port Jackson, but never saw it or explored it. Governor Arthur Phillip was the first European to see Sydney Harbour 18 years later. Cook made his way north, then negotiated the Great Barrier Reef, and when the Endeavour struck a coral reef near what would become Cooktown, it was pulled ashore and repaired. He claimed the land for Britain at Possession Island and sailed home via Batavia and Cape Town. The captain discovered how to prevent scurvy by making his crew eat vegetables and drink fruit juice. The cottage in which James Cook grew up at Great Ayton in Yorkshire was moved stone by stone in 1934 and is now in Fitzroy Gardens in Melbourne. Any of that sound familiar? Simplifying history for school textbooks and general public consumption always means that much of the story is not told, particularly the political agendas and social issues of the time that led to the events. Kids are often curious about details that teachers mostly don't know or have no time to research. Adults are simply not interested in too much detail. They are not historians and they want the simple version. Often they like the version they were told at school and believe the myths and consequently perpetuate them. The problem with the simple version of the Endeavour voyage, however, is that most of it is simply not true. Here are 10 commonly believed myths about James Cook and HMB Endeavour, debunked and explained. 10 James Cook Furphies. Number 1. Captain Cook sailed in the Endeavour. Let's begin by getting one thing straight. Captain Cook did not exist until 1775. So to say that Captain Cook did anything at all on the Endeavour voyage, 1768 to 71, is technically incorrect. Lieutenant James Cook, having been given his commission in 1768, was the highest-ranking officer on board and therefore in command, i.e. ship's captain, of the Endeavour. Promoted in 1771 to the official rank of commander, a rank higher than lieutenant but below captain, he was in command of the Resolution on his second voyage of discovery, 1772 to 75. Having been promoted on his return to captain, he was later appointed in 1775 to the position of officer in charge at the Greenwich Hospital, retired sailors' home, and given the higher rank of post-captain. In the preface to the 1893 publication Captain Cook's Journal during his first voyage round the world, compiled from 3 different copies of Cook's journals, editor William Wharton notes, "It must be understood that although this book is styled Captain Cook's Journal, he was on this voyage only a lieutenant in command, and therefore only captain by courtesy." In June 1755, James Cook resigned his position as mate on Walker Brothers' collier Friendship and voluntarily joined the Navy as an able seaman when he signed on at the Rondy in Wapping, London. The Rondy was the name given to any pub chosen as the rendezvous by the impress officer or regulating captain. These men were naval officers who used a pub near the docks as a base for recruiting. As part of the recruiting system, the impress service used retired naval men or those on leave as press gangs to force men into the Navy. Impressment was commonly enforced during the 18th century by Acts of Parliament passed in 1703, 1705, 1740 and 1779. Royal Navy vessels could also stop British merchant ships at sea or arriving in port and take crew members forcibly into service. James Cook reports this happening on his orders several times on ships on which he served. There was a war brewing in 1755, and the Navy was recruiting. Many men also joined of their own free will, and one of them was James Cook. We don't know why he resigned from Walker Brothers Shipping Company of Whitby and signed on, but we do know that leaving Walker Brothers was an amicable agreement, and James Cook and John Walker remained lifelong friends. Walker later wrote that Cook had always wanted to join the Navy. After signing on at Wapping, Cook was sent to Portsmouth to join HMS Eagle. When Captain Hugh Palliser took command of the Eagle in October 1755, Cook was acting as master's mate. The 7 Years' War began a year later, and after HMS Eagle captured the French East Indiaman Duc d'Aquitaine after a furious battle in the Bay of Biscay, Cook passed the required examination in London and became a ship's master. This meant he was responsible for navigation and the day-to-day running of the vessel and was required to keep a logbook for the Admiralty. After the war, as a senior warrant officer, he was master in command of a navigation and charting vessel, the schooner Grenville. But he wasn't an officer by rank and did not have a commission. In order to take command of the Endeavour on an Admiralty expedition, regulations said he had to be a commissioned officer. So, Cook was made a lieutenant on the 25th of May, 1768. The practice of appointing lieutenants to command vessels, especially smaller ones, was common. The term given to this was lieutenant commanding, which later evolved into the rank of lieutenant commander. So, while there is no doubt that James Cook was a brave and an extremely talented navigator and chart maker, he was not a commissioned officer when he was chosen to captain the Endeavour. He came from a humble background and had joined the Navy quite late, at 26 years of age, as a midshipman. The skills he had gained during his 9 years as merchant mariner, including several years as mate with Walker Brothers, along with his remarkable charting and navigational abilities, had enabled him to rise as high as any man could in the Royal Navy without having a commission. It was only on his third and final voyage, 1776-80, also on the Resolution, after he came out of semi-retirement, that he would have been referred to as Captain James Cook. On the Endeavour voyage he was in command of the vessel, but he didn't hold the rank of captain. Footnote: to make things even more confusing, until 1794, the commissioned rank of commander was referred to as Master and Commander. This became simply Commander after 1794 to save confusion, as there was also a warrant officer, that is, non-commissioned officer with a warrant to give orders, on every Royal Navy ship of a certain size who was known as the ship's master. This non-commissioned warrant officer gave the crew specific orders for running the vessel. James Cook had been the sailing master and ship's master of several vessels before receiving his commission as a lieutenant and becoming the Endeavour's lieutenant in command. The master on the Endeavour, incidentally, was a very capable young man named Robert Molyneux, who died at Cape Town on the journey home. This ends CD 3.